She was dying in the middle of a blizzard, and the worst hadn't even happened yet. Leora had no idea that the dark little cabin she'd just broken into for shelter belonged to the most dangerous man in the kingdom, an exile, an alpha who had once made the entire Wolf Council tremble with a single look. And now, he was on his way back, while she was asleep beside his fire. You think she's going to run? Wrong. She's going to stay, and that decision is going to change the entire kingdom. Stay until the very end. Hit like if you love wolf stories, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world this story is finding you. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky above the Velthar Mountains had been the dull pewter gray of a late afternoon in deep winter, and the next, it was gone. Swallowed whole by a wall of white fury that screamed down from the northern peaks like something alive, something hungry, something that had decided tonight was the night it would devour everything it touched. Leora ran anyway. She had been running for 3 days. Her boots, stolen from a supply shed 2 nights before she escaped, were 2 sizes too large and had long since soaked through. Every step sent a lance of cold through her feet so sharp it no longer felt like cold. It felt like fire. She had heard once, from an old woman in the healer's ward of the Ashvale compound, that frostbite felt like burning before it felt like nothing at all. She was starting to believe it. Keep moving, she told herself, the words forming silently behind cracked lips because she no longer had the breath to speak them out loud. Just keep moving. The wound along her left side, 3 fingers wide, carved into her by the edge of Warden Drace's blade the morning she fled, had stopped bleeding sometime yesterday. That was either because it was clotting or because her body had simply run out of blood to spare. She had wrapped it with a strip torn from the inner lining of her stolen coat, and she tried not to think about how the fabric had gone stiff and dark. She tried not to think about a lot of things. She tried not to think about Mira, the youngest girl in the healing ward, who had looked at her with enormous dark eyes when Leora slipped away in the pre-dawn silence and had not said a word. Not a sound, just those eyes, watching. Old eyes in a small face, the eyes of a child who had already learned that hope was something you kept perfectly still inside your chest so no one could take it from you. I'll come back for you, Leora had promised with her hands, the way they communicated when the wardens were near. I will come back. She didn't know if that was a lie. She was starting to think she wouldn't survive the night to make it true or false. The forest grew denser as she climbed, the pine trees enormous and ancient, their branches locked together overhead in a canopy that blocked out the worst of the howling wind. The snow was thinner here under the trees and only knee-deep rather than waist-deep in the open passes, and Leora pushed through it with the mechanical determination of someone who had already made the decision that stopping meant dying and had therefore removed stopping from the list of available options. Her packed senses, dulled by years of captivity, of suppressants slipped into the communal water at Ashvale, of deliberate psychological erosion designed to make her small and quiet and obedient, had still managed to register something half a mile back. A shift in the air, a scent beneath the snow and the pine resin, and her own fear sweat, wood smoke, faint and old but unmistakably present, curling through the frozen air like a question. Wood smoke means a structure. A structure means walls. Walls mean shelter. It was the most basic form of survival logic, stripped down to its bones by desperation. She didn't let herself think about who might be inside. She didn't let herself think at all. Thinking was a luxury for people who were not currently dying. She smelled it again, stronger now, or maybe she was simply closer. And then she saw it. The cabin emerged from the darkness between 2 massive pines like something out of a half-remembered dream, squat and broad-shouldered, built from logs so old they had gone black with age and weather. The roof was buried under several feet of snow that had accumulated in layers, each storm adding its own stratum like pages in a book. The single window was dark. No light showed under the door. Leora stood at the edge of the tree line for a long moment, swaying slightly, snow crusting on her eyelashes and in the fur trim of her stolen hood. Her instincts were saying something, the part of her that was still wolf beneath all the suppressants and the fear, and the 3 days of running was pressing against the inside of her ribs like a caged animal pressing against bars. But she was too cold and too exhausted and too close to the edge of not surviving to listen carefully. Empty, she told herself. It's empty. It's been empty for a long time. She crossed the clearing in 7 strides and tried the door. Locked. Of course. She stepped back, braced herself against the cold, stiffened protest of her muscles, and put her shoulder into it with the full weight of her desperation behind it. The old lock gave with a crack like a gunshot, and she stumbled inside. The cold inside the cabin was different from the cold outside. Still, rather than vicious, with the quality of cold that had simply settled in and made itself at home, rather than cold that was actively trying to kill you. Leora's body recognized the distinction and began to tremble, which was actually a good sign. You stopped trembling when you ran out of the energy required to shiver. She stood just inside the door, breath rasping, and forced herself to assess. The cabin was one large room, solid plank floor, packed earth beneath that. A stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall, cold, but with a thick bed of old ash that suggested it was used regularly. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs. A sleeping platform built against the far wall with furs piled on it, dark and heavy. A row of iron hooks near the door, empty. Shelves along one wall with clay jars, folded cloth, and a few items she couldn't identify in the dark. And above everything, beneath the wood smoke and the cold and the pine and the old structure smell of aged logs, something else. Something that hit her depleted wolf senses like a fist to the sternum. Alpha, dominant, ancient, male. The territorial scent so saturated into the walls and the furs and the very wood of the floor that it was less a smell and more a fact. The incontrovertible biological fact of a presence that demanded acknowledgement from everything within its radius. Leora's knees nearly buckled. Omega response, the detached, clinical part of her brain noted, even suppressed, even exhausted. That's how strong it is. She should leave. Every remaining shred of self-preservation instinct was telling her to leave, to back out the broken door and back into the storm and take her chances with the cold. An unmated Omega who had escaped from a captive situation, trespassing in the territory of an unknown Alpha. You will die in that storm before you reach the next tree line. She already knew that. She had known it from the moment she felt her feet stop responding properly 3 hours ago. She was past the threshold where fear of consequences could override the physics of survival. She crossed to the fireplace on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and she built a fire. She was good at fires. In Asheville, they had made the Omega healers responsible for every fire in the compound. The wardens didn't do labor they could assign to the captured. And Leora had built so many fires in so many terrible conditions that she could do it half asleep, half dead. She stacked tinder from the pile near the hearth, drew sparks from the flint and steel she found on the mantel, coaxed the flame with the focused, unhurried attention she had learned to give every small task because small tasks were the only kind that had ever truly belonged to her. The fire caught. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she simply stood with her palms extended toward it and her eyes closed, feeling her face begin to ache with the specific agonizing sensation of skin remembering temperature. Then she stripped off her soaked outer layers, hung them over the backs of the chairs, and examined her wound. It was worse than she'd hoped. Not immediately life-threatening, but infected. The edges red and puffy, hot to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the beginnings of sepsis if she left it much longer. She found clean cloth on the shelves and water in a covered clay pot, heated it on the now roaring fire, and cleaned the wound with the steady, methodical care of a trained healer, the kind of care she had given to 100 others and so rarely been permitted to give herself. She didn't let herself use her ability. That was the hardest part. The healing gift burned at her palms, eager, like a living thing that wanted to be useful. She could feel it pressing against the inside of her hands, the way the alpha scent pressed against her instincts. Insistent, biological, demanding. She kept her hands ordinary. She cleaned the wound the ordinary way, with cloth and water and careful pressure. Using the gift would leave a trace. If anyone was tracking her, and Warden Drace would certainly be tracking her, a flare of healing energy in the frozen wilderness would be a beacon. She had survived 9 years in Asheville by being invisible, and old habits of invisibility were the hardest to abandon. When she had done what she could, she moved to the sleeping platform, wrapped herself in the heavy furs that smelled overwhelmingly, impossibly, of that alpha, and tried to think rationally about her situation. The owner of this cabin will return. Possibly tonight. Possibly tomorrow. Unknown timeline. When he returns, he will find a trespassing Omega in his bed. An unmated, escaped Omega with suppressed presentation who broke his lock and raided his supplies. Options? Leave before he returns. Wait and explain. Wait and hide. Leaving means dying. Explaining means trusting a stranger. Hiding means lying. Her body made the decision before her mind finished the reasoning. The warmth of the fire and the furs and the terrible bone-deep exhaustion of 3 days of running through frozen mountains pulled her under with a slowness that felt, terrifyingly, like peace. She was asleep before she finished the thought. Ronan Vale heard the broken lock before he reached the clearing. He stopped at the tree line, one hand rising instinctively to the knife at his hip, and stood motionless in the howling wind for a long moment. The storm had worsened in the hours since he'd left to track the territorial markers on the eastern boundary. Fresh marks, enemy marks, the kind left deliberately close and deliberately bold by scouts who wanted him to know they'd been there. He'd followed the trail longer than he should have, and now the weather had turned vicious, which was the mountain's way of reminding him that it didn't care about the politics of wolves. He had expected to come home to an empty cabin and a cold hearth. Instead, the door hung slightly open, firelight leaking gold from the gap, and his territorial instincts were doing something complex and unfamiliar that he categorized with extreme skepticism as not alarm. He approached with his hand on the knife and his weight distributed toward the balls of his feet, and every alpha sense he possessed extended to their full, considerable range. One person. Small, much smaller than his frame could account for. Injured. The sharp metallic edge of blood under the wood smoke and the clean cloth smell of bandaging. And beneath all of it, muted and strange, like music heard through several walls, the unmistakable biological signature of Omega. Ronan pushed the door open and stood in the entrance, snow gusting past him into the room, and looked at the sleeping platform. The figure in his furs was small, genuinely small, not just smaller than him small, and buried to the chin in pelts with only a pale face visible and dark hair fanned against the skins. Her breathing was slow and even. Her color was poor, the kind of gray-tinged pallor that came from extended exposure and blood loss. But she was breathing, and the fire was strong. And whoever she had built that fire with the competence of someone who knew what they were doing. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, snow settling on his shoulders, and looked at her. The knife did not leave his hand, but he didn't advance either. What in the frozen hell, Ronan thought, which was not a particularly articulate thought for a man who had once commanded armies, but was, under the circumstances, reasonably accurate. He had been alone in these mountains for 2 years. Before that, he had been in a series of other places that were also variations on alone, each one colder and more remote than the last. Each one chosen specifically because it was the kind of place that people who wanted to find Ronan Vale, and there were many such people, and they wanted to find him for reasons that universally ended in his death, would find difficult to reach. He had chosen the Velthar range precisely because in winter, with the passes closed, it was nearly inaccessible. Nearly being, apparently, the operative word. He stepped inside and closed the door, because the storm was worsening and he was not going to heat the entire mountain range. He stood with his back against the door and let his eyes adjust fully to the firelight and looked at her properly. She had wrapped her wound herself. He could see the edge of the bandaging at her ribs where the blanket had shifted. The wrapping was good, clean technique, even pressure, the kind of care you learn from practice rather than instinct. Her hands, curled at the edges of the pelts, were a healer's hands. The small scars on the palms that came from years of herb work, the ink stains at the fingertips, the careful trimming of nails that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with wanting to keep wounds clean. A healer, Ronan thought, an Omega healer who came here through the worst storm of the season with a wound in her side and no companion and a broken lock. That was a story. He didn't know the story yet, but he knew enough stories about Omega healers in the northern packs to feel the beginning of something cold and specific settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter. He crossed to the fire added 2 more logs, and pulled one of the chairs to a position from which he could watch the door and the sleeping platform simultaneously. He sat. He did not sleep. He waited. Leora woke to the feeling of being watched. It was not a gentle waking. Her eyes opened all at once, the way they had learned to open in Ashvale, where the transition from sleep to full alertness was a survival skill rather than a luxury, and in the space of a single heartbeat, she had assessed the room, located the fire, located the changed position of the furniture, and located the man in the chair. She sat up so fast the furs fell away, and her back hit the wall behind the sleeping platform, and she had the folded knife she kept in her boot in her hand before she had consciously decided to reach for it. The man in the chair didn't move. He was vast. That was the only word her still waking brain could produce. Not merely large, not merely tall, but vast in the way that old trees were vast, the kind of scale that made you aware of your own dimensions in comparison. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and his dark eyes, extraordinarily dark, almost black in the firelight, fixed on her with an expression that was completely unreadable. "You're sitting in your own chair," Leora said, which was not the most cogent opening statement, but her mouth was apparently working independently of whatever part of her brain was responsible for threat assessment. "I am," the man said. His voice was very low, the kind of voice that had nothing to prove, that had spent so long not needing to be raised that it had forgotten how to be anything but quiet and absolute. "And you're sleeping in my bed." "I'm sitting up in your bed." "You were sleeping in it when I arrived." A pause. Leora's grip on the knife did not loosen, but she was doing rapid calculations. He hadn't moved toward her when she woke. He hadn't moved at all. He was an alpha. She could feel that pressing reality from across the room, the territorial weight of him that made her suppressed omega instincts go simultaneously very loud and very quiet. But he had apparently sat in his chair and watched her sleep rather than waking her, which was not the behavior of someone who meant immediate harm. Or he's exceptionally patient. The part of her brain that 9 years of captivity had developed into a very fine instrument said, and he's waiting for something. "How long have you been back?" she asked. 3 hours. 3 hours. He had sat in that chair for 3 hours while she slept in his furs. She felt the back of her neck prickle with something she couldn't name. Not danger exactly. Something more complicated. "You could have woken me." "You needed the sleep." He said it flatly, like a fact, not a kindness. "You'd been running for at least 2 days before you got here. Probably 3. Your body was shutting down. You could tell that from looking at me." "I could tell that from looking at you." Leora studied him across the room. The firelight moved over the planes of his face, a hard face, weathered and scarred, with the kind of bone structure that suggested centuries of alpha bloodline, the jaw that could have been carved rather than grown. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and the ghost of it in the short beard at his jaw. His eyes hadn't moved from her face, not to the knife, not to the wound at her side, not to catalog her the way captors cataloged property. Just her face. "Who are you?" she asked. Something shifted in those dark eyes. Not amusement exactly, but its distant relative. "I should ask you that first. You broke into my home. Your lock was old. It was fine until recently. I would have knocked, but I was fairly occupied with dying. So I noticed." He unclasped his hands and sat back in the chair, and the shift in his posture was such a deliberate gesture of not threatening that she recognized it as the behavior of someone who understood exactly how imposing his physical presence was and was choosing, for reasons of his own, to compensate for it. "You're a healer." It wasn't a question. Her hand stiffened. "I know the rap," he said, "and the ink on your fingers, and the way you cleaned the wound before you slept. I can smell the herb water you used. It was good work. For someone mostly dead. For anyone." A pause. "The wound needs more attention than you could give it on your own. The left side, under the ribs. The infection's early, but it'll turn serious inside of another day if it's not properly cleaned and treated." Leora blinked. "You know wound care." "I've had reason to learn." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. The storm screamed against the roof and the small dark window. and the cabin held against it with the solidity of something built to last. And the alpha across the room sat in his chair and met her eyes and waited. "Leora," she said finally. "My name is Leora." "Ronan." It took her a moment. The name was familiar, lodged somewhere in the back of her memory, the way names heard in whispers tended to lodge, too significant to forget and too dangerous to speak clearly. She turned it over, trying to place it, and when she placed it, she felt the knife in her hand become suddenly much less adequate. "Ronan Vale," she said. He watched her without expression. The exiled king. Former king. The exile tends to be the current relevant title. "You were exiled by the council." She was speaking slowly, the way she spoke when she was thinking, testing the shape of the information out loud. 7 years ago. The Iron Council accused you of, yes, of conspiring to dissolve the hierarchy, to eliminate the rank structure, to... She stopped. That was what the wardens at Ashvale told us. The Omega Quarters. They used you as an example of why the hierarchy had to be protected, why alphas who questioned the structure were dangerous. She paused. They made you sound like a monster. Did they? They made you sound very specifically like the kind of monster that Omegas should be grateful was gone. She studied his face. You don't look like that. Most monsters don't. No. She lowered the knife, not all the way, but fractionally. Most monsters look like perfectly ordinary people, in my experience. Something moved behind his eyes at that. Brief, specific, the kind of expression that came and went too fast to name unless you were very good at reading the faces of people who had decided a long time ago not to let their faces say too much. Leora was very good at that. 9 years of watching Wardens for Tells had made her very, very good. You escaped from a pack, Ronan said. Yes. Ashvale. Yes. How long were you there? The question was quiet. Not casual. Nothing about this man was casual, but stripped of everything except genuine inquiry. Leora found, to her considerable confusion, that she wanted to answer it. 9 years, she said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Ronan's hands were still loosely clasped, his posture still contained, but something in the room had changed slightly. A degree of pressure, a shift in the air, like the moment before weather turned. 9 years, he repeated, and his voice had the same flatness it had carried before. But underneath the flatness, there was something else, something controlled very carefully. I was brought in as a healer. I was 12. She said it the way she had learned to say all the facts about Ashvale, cleanly, without inflection, because the inflection was where the damage lived. They needed healers. They had a policy about Omegas with particular gifts. You became compound property. Compound property, Ronan said, and the way he said it was a very specific kind of quiet. That was the official designation. She tilted her head, watching him. Why aren't you threatening me? I broke into your home. I'm a trespassing Omega from an enemy pack who knows your location. You have every tactical reason to... I don't harm women who are fleeing for their lives, Ronan said. He said it simply, without grandeur, the way you stated a thing that was foundational rather than notable, as if it would not have occurred to him to frame it any other way. Leora looked at him for a long moment. Then she put the knife down on the sleeping platform beside her. Not away, just down, a gesture of measured trust rather than full surrender, and said, My wound actually does need attention. I know, Ronan said, and stood up. He worked by firelight with supplies from the shelf, herbs she recognized, clean cloth, a preparation she didn't know that smelled powerfully of pine resin and something astringent that turned out to be remarkably effective at drawing heat from infected tissue. His hands were large and scarred, and moved with a carefulness that contrasted so sharply with everything she had been told to expect from an alpha, any alpha, and certainly this one, that she found herself watching them more than was necessary or strategic. This will hurt, he said, before he removed the old bandaging. I know. Tell me if you need me to stop. I won't. Tell me anyway. She looked at the side of his face, bent over the work. You give orders even when you're being kind. He glanced up at that briefly. Is it bothering you? No. She paused. It's actually clarifying. I'm used to orders that have nothing to do with kindness. He was quiet for a moment, his hands still careful, the astringent preparation doing its work. Then, what was your gift? At Ashvale, they take Omegas with particular gifts, you said. Leora kept her face neutral. I'm a healer. You said that. I'm asking about the gift specifically. He looked up again, and his dark eyes were direct. Not demanding, just direct. The kind of directness that was, in its own way, a form of respect. I can feel traces of it, even suppressed. The air around your hands is different. She had not expected that. Most alphas couldn't detect it. The suppressants at Ashvale had been specifically designed to mask it from non-healers. But the traces, apparently, were not entirely invisible to someone with his level of sensitivity. What does it feel like? She asked, instead of answering, genuinely curious. Like heat, he said, but deeper than surface heat. Like the warmth that comes from the inside of something rather than the outside. He was quiet for a moment, finishing the cleaning with a focus that meant he was thinking. It's a restoration gift. She said nothing. Those are rare, he said. The Council has been trying to catalog them for decades. Every Omega with a restoration gift that's been identified has been... He stopped. Collected, Leora finished. Yes, that's the word they use. Ronan's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but she perceived it, and then resumed. You've been hiding it, he said, for 9 years. That must have been exhausting. The simplicity of that, the accurate, undramatized recognition of it, hit her somewhere between the ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. She had to breathe through it carefully. It was, she said. It is. Yes. He finished the bandaging in silence. The new wrap was better than hers, firmer at the edges where it mattered, allowing more movement than she'd permitted herself. He was, as he'd said, good at wound care. She didn't ask again why. She thought she could guess the shape of a life that had required it. When he stepped back, she pulled her shirt carefully down and looked at him. Why did the Council exile you? She asked. The real reason. Ronan stood with his back to the fire, which put his face in shadow and lit him from behind in a way that made him look like something carved from the darkness of the mountain itself. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I tried to change the mating laws. Leora went still. The forced bonding protocols. The policy that allowed pack councils to assign Omegas to Alphas for political alliances regardless of consent. His voice was completely flat. I tried to have them struck from the law. I introduced a charter that would have made unbonded Omega status a protected designation instead of a liability. That every mating required acknowledgement and choice from both parties. He paused. The Council decided that constituted a threat to hierarchical stability. Leora looked at him for a long time. They were right, she said finally, about it being a threat. Yes, Ronan said. They were right about that. The fire snapped, the storm howled, the cabin held. You didn't do it for Omegas specifically, she said, still watching him. You did it because you thought the hierarchy was wrong. I did it because I thought people should be able to choose, he said. The designation they're born with shouldn't determine whether their choices matter. That's a very dangerous thing for an Alpha King to think. It is. I've had 7 years in exile to confirm it. Leora pulled the furs back around her shoulders, not from cold exactly, but from the particular vulnerability of being accurately seen by someone she had just met, someone who should by all logic terrify her, and instead was doing something much more complicated than that. I should sleep more, she said. My body needs it. Yes, Ronan said. It does. You'll wake me if I'll keep watch, he said. Sleep. She wanted to argue on principle. She didn't take orders. She had spent 9 years quietly not taking orders while appearing to, but the words came out of him the same way the fire built, steady, practical, the form of a statement rather than a command. and her body was still desperately exhausted beneath the thin surface of adrenaline that had carried her through the conversation. She lay back against the furs. The fire was warm. The storm was loud and very far away. The alpha across the room settled back into his chair with the contained patience of something that had learned to wait without restlessness and kept his eyes on the door. Leora closed her eyes. "You're in the cabin of the exiled king," she told herself, cataloging the facts the way she always cataloged them, because facts were the architecture that held her together when everything else was uncertain. He knows you're an escaped Omega with a restoration gift. He knows who you came from. He has every reason to turn you in or use you as leverage, or he made your bandage better. She fell asleep holding that fact, which was either the most naive thing she had ever done or the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. Outside, the storm reached its full voice, howling and enormous and indifferent to the small, warm light in the dark mountain's heart. Inside, Ronan Vale sat in his chair and watched the door, and did not sleep at all. And in the space between his watchfulness and her exhausted rest, something unnamed and almost impossible had taken its first tentative root in the frozen ground. The second morning came gray and silent. The storm had burned itself out sometime before dawn, leaving behind the particular stillness that only exists in high mountain country after a major weather event, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful so much as exhausted, as if the world itself had spent everything it had and was now lying flat, breathing slowly, waiting to see what came next. Leora woke before Ronan. That surprised her. She had assumed, based on every alpha she had ever observed, which admittedly had all been alphas of the Ashvale variety, possessive and territorial and hypervigilant about their sleeping spaces, that he would be awake first, already positioned between her and the door, already reasserting the geometry of dominance that defined how alphas moved through space. Instead, she opened her eyes to find the chair across the room empty and the fire rebuilt to a steady, radiating warmth, and Ronan stretched on the floor beside the hearth with his back to the heat and his coat pulled over him as a blanket, sleeping with the complete, absolute stillness of someone who had trained themselves out of restlessness. He had given her the sleeping platform. He had given her the furs. He had slept on the floor. Leora sat with that for a moment, turning it over carefully in her mind the way you turned over something unexpected to check it from every angle, looking for the catch, for the manipulation embedded in the gesture. She found none, which was itself so unusual that she sat with it a moment longer, recalibrating. Her wound ached, not the sharp hot ache of infection. The astringent treatment had clearly done its work, the heat already significantly reduced, but the deep pulling ache of tissue beginning the serious work of knitting itself back together. She was sore from her spine to her feet, and her head felt thick with the residue of exhaustion not yet fully resolved. But she was alive. She was warm. She was, improbably, inexplicably, in a safer position than she had been 48 hours ago. She moved quietly to the shelves and found the clay jars she'd catalogued the night before. She had been too exhausted then to examine them properly. Now she opened each one with careful hands and noted what was inside with the focused attention of a healer taking inventory. Dried yarrow, good for fever. Dried pine needles, vitamin content and antiseptic properties. Something she identified by smell as valerian root, birch bark in flat strips. A preparation she didn't recognize that smelled medicinal, in a way that suggested mountain herb knowledge she hadn't encountered before. She also found, in a lower shelf behind the folded cloth, a supply of dried meat and hard biscuit, military-style rations, the kind designed for extended field conditions. Enough for weeks if rationed carefully. She replaced everything exactly as she found it. Then she found a small iron pot, filled it with snow from the drift that had accumulated inside the broken door, and set it over the fire. When the water was hot, she used the yarrow and some of the pine needles to make a simple medicinal tea, and she poured 2 cups. She was placing the second cup near the hearth when Ronan opened his eyes. He went from apparently asleep to fully alert in the same way she did. No gradual surfacing, no disorientation, just eyes closed, then eyes open and tracking. The immediate, complete awareness of a predator who had survived long enough to treat sleep as a controlled vulnerability rather than an abandonment of it. His gaze found her. Then the tea, then the door, then back to her. You moved things on the shelf, he said. His voice was rougher in the morning, less contained. I was doing inventory. I put them back exactly as they were. She sat down in the other chair and wrapped her hands around her own cup. Your herb knowledge is good, better than standard alpha field medicine. He sat up slowly, and she noted, cataloged the way she cataloged everything, the way he moved. There was a stiffness in his right side that he controlled carefully but couldn't entirely eliminate. Old injury. Significant, probably structural, the kind of damage that healed around a fault line rather than through it. I've had time to learn, he said, taking the cup she'd left near the hearth without comment or particular display of gratitude. He drank. How long have you actually been in this range? 2 years in this cabin, 5 years in various other places before that. He looked at the fire. The council's hunters are thorough. You move or you get found. But you're still here, in the same place. That's a risk. I've reinforced the eastern boundaries enough that movement approaching from below triggers a response. I have approximately 4 hours warning before anyone reaches the cabin from the nearest access point. A pause. Which is why I know the marks I found yesterday weren't casual scouting. Leora went still. What marks? He looked at her then. Fresh territorial markers on the eastern ridge, left within the last 48 hours. Multiple wolves. I counted tracks for at least 6 individuals. They weren't hunters passing through. They were establishing a perimeter. You think they know you're here? I think they've known for a while and have been deciding what to do about it. His voice was utterly level. The storm delayed them. Now that it's cleared, they'll move. Yes. The words settled into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Leora looked at the door, repaired, she now noticed, with a bar of wood wedged across the frame that hadn't been there when she arrived, something Ronan must have done during the night. Solid. Temporary. How many can you handle? She asked. He looked at her with something close to surprise. Not alarm at the question, but a mild recalibration. The expression of someone who had not expected that to be the first question she asked. Most people, that expression suggested, ask something else first. Something about whether she should hide or run, or what he was going to do. Alone? 4, possibly 5, depending on their caliber. He turned the cup in his hands. Council hunters are trained specifically for high-value extraction and containment. They don't fight the way regular pack wolves fight. They work in coordinated units. The number I tracked suggests a unit of 2 standard teams, 6 to 8 individuals. That's too many. Yes. So we need to leave. Something shifted in his expression at the word we. Subtle, controlled, but there. You're not in condition to travel hard terrain. Your wound is manageable. She met his eyes. I've moved in worse condition, and staying in a fixed position against 8 coordinated hunters with nowhere to retreat is not a viable strategy for either of us. For me, he said. You could... Don't, Leora said. He stopped. Don't tell me I could leave and they'd have no reason to bother with me. Her voice was quiet and entirely firm. I'm an escaped Omega from Ashvale with a restoration gift that the Council has been trying to catalog for 9 years. If your hunters found my tracks leading here, they know there are 2 of us, and they know what I am. She held his gaze. I'm not an unrelated problem you can set aside. I'm a second target. Ronan was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then something in his jaw settled. All right, he said. All right, she repeated. So, we leave. When? Ideally tonight. We lose the daylight advantage, but gain the thermal disadvantage for their tracking. Wolf scent disperses faster in cold night air. He turned to look at the shelves. I'll pack what matters. 2 hours to prepare. 1 hour, Leora said. If they moved at first light, 4 hours is optimistic. A pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, 1 hour. She stood and moved to the shelves, and they began the precise, efficient work of people who understand that preparation is the difference between surviving and not, and who, despite having known each other for less than 24 hours, had arrived, without negotiating it, at a working partnership. They were 40 minutes into preparation when Leora heard it. She had been rolling the medicinal stores into a tight bundle using the cloth from the lower shelf. her hands moving with the quick competence of someone who had packed and unpacked under pressure many times. And she was halfway through calculating the weight distribution of the pack Ronan had produced from beneath the sleeping platform when the sound reached her. Faint, from somewhere on the eastern slope, buried under the ambient noise of the post-storm mountain. She stopped. Ronan. He was already at the window, one hand flat against the frame, looking at the angle of the tree line with the concentrated stillness of someone reading a language she couldn't yet see. He said nothing. His body had gone very quiet in the particular way of predators that were deciding between types of action. "How many?" Leora asked. "At least 4 from the east." He moved to the door, lifted the bar, cracked it open an inch. A breath of cold air, and then 2 more from the north, coming down the ridge. He closed the door and replaced the bar. His voice was absolutely calm. "They moved at first light. We have perhaps 20 minutes. Can we run?" "Not without being seen crossing the clearing. The snow is undisturbed. We'd be tracked before we reached the western tree line." He was already moving, pulling things from the wall, checking the knife at his hip. "There's a passage under the floor, a crawl space that leads to a secondary exit behind the woodpile. It was built for exactly this. Then, it exits onto an exposed slope." He looked at her directly. "In the open, with 2 teams of council hunters who run significantly faster than an Omega with a healing wound, we don't make the tree line." The options arranged themselves in Leora's mind with the cold, functional clarity of someone who had spent years in an environment where the cost of miscalculation was immediate. Run and be caught in the open. Stay and be trapped in the cabin. Fight inside. Better odds for him, possibly, but still outnumbered. And she was a healer, not a combatant. "Fight from inside," she said. Ronan looked at her. "You said 4, possibly 5, depending on caliber. If they come in through the door, they come in 1 or 2 at a time. That's a better ratio than an open slope." She held his gaze. "The cabin is defensible, not permanently, but long enough to change the numbers." "You're a healer." "I'm a healer who spent 9 years in a compound run by people who believed Omegas needed to be managed. You learn to defend yourself or you don't survive." A beat. "I'm not going to be dead weight in your hands. Tell me what you need." Something moved across Ronan Vale's face that she had no category for. Something deep and quick, like the shift of light on water. Then he moved to the shelf, and he put a short iron blade in her hands. Not a knife exactly, more of a fighting tool, balanced for close-quarter use. And he said, "The fireplace. Stand at the fireplace. Any wolf that gets past me goes to you. If they surround you, they won't get the chance." His voice was quiet and absolute. "Ronan, if they surround you, then we improvise." He met her eyes. "Can you do this?" Leora looked at the blade in her hands. She thought about 9 years of not being able to do anything. She thought about Mira's old eyes and a small face. "Yes," she said. "Uab." They came through this door first, 2 of them, shoulders together, moving with the synchronized efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of forced entry, the bar on the door snapping under the combined impact of their weight and momentum. They were big. "Council Hunter caliber," Ronan had said, and looking at them she understood exactly what that meant. Trained, coordinated, operating as a unit rather than as individuals. Ronan met them before they fully cleared the threshold. Leora had seen Alphas fight before. At Ashvale, the wardens occasionally demonstrated combat against each other for the compound's hierarchy reinforcement. Theatrical, performative, designed to remind everyone watching exactly where they stood. What Ronan did looked nothing like that. It was quiet. That was the first thing she registered. There was no snarling, no posturing, no alpha display of dominance meant to intimidate before the first contact. He simply moved, with a speed and economy that seemed almost impossible for a man of his size. And the first hunter was on the floor before she had fully processed that contact had been made. The second hunter adapted fast, faster than she'd expected, adjusting his angle before Ronan could fully redirect. And the next 20 seconds were something she watched with all of her attention because she had to know what was happening. She had to track it. She had to be ready for the moment it went wrong. 2 more came through the window. Ronan registered them. She could see in the subtle shift of his weight that he registered them. And she could see, in the same fraction of a second, the calculation. 4 targets and the first 2 not yet neutralized, and the cabin was 30 feet across at its widest point. The third hunter, coming over the sill on the left, turned toward Leora. She hit him with the iron blade grip first across the jaw before he fully cleared the window frame, putting every pound she had into the swing because she did not have the physical weight to do this twice. He went sideways, half into the window, and she got the blade edge up before he could recover. "Behind you!" Ronan's voice. She dropped. She had spent years learning when not to ask questions. The fourth hunter's arm passed over her head, and then Ronan was there. And then that hunter was also on the floor. And the cabin was very loud for approximately 8 seconds, and then it was quiet. Leora straightened slowly, breathing hard, the blade still in her hand. Her wound had torn. She could feel it, the hot wetness against the bandaging, and she pressed her elbow against her side automatically to control the bleeding. 4 hunters on the floor, 2 unconscious, 2 incapacitated. But from outside she could hear movement, more movement, the 2 from the north ridge closing in, and at least 1 more who hadn't entered but hanging back, coordinating. Ronan was breathing harder than when they'd started. He had a cut along his forearm, and he was favoring his right side. That old injury, she thought, the structural fault, and the fight had stressed it. His face was controlled, but she could see the effort of that control, the slight whitening around the jaw. "How bad?" she said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She crossed to him, put her hand against his right side. Not a gesture of care, a healer's assessment, clinical and fast. He went still under her touch. She pressed carefully at the ribs, felt him control the flinch. "Old injury, re-aggravated. Is it structural or it's manageable?" "Ronan." He met her eyes. In the dim cabin with 4 unconscious hunters on the floor and 2 more coming down the ridge and her wound open and his side stressed, he met her eyes and she watched him do the calculation that he clearly did not want to do. The old damage is on the right side, deep tissue. When it flares, yes, it limits my range of motion, significantly. A beat. I can still fight. At half capacity against 2 more trained hunters. Yes, that's not enough. No. He looked at the door. Outside, the movement was getting closer. It's probably not. Leora looked at her hands. She looked at the iron blade. She looked at the hunters on the floor, at the window, at the door with its broken bar, at Ronan standing with his hand pressed against his ribs and his face carved into a mask of controlled insufficiency. She thought about the suppressants at Ashvale and the 9 years of keeping her hands ordinary and the traces that Ronan had detected because he was sensitive enough to detect them and the tracking risk she had weighed every time she considered using the gift. A flare of healing energy in the frozen wilderness would be a beacon. She was already found. They were already here. The beacon was already lit. Leora put her hand flat against Ronan's right side and she let the gift go. It came out of her like something that had been held underwater too long. Not explosive, not dramatic, but with the terrible relief of pressure finding release. She felt it move through her palms and into the damaged tissue of his flank, heat that had nothing to do with temperature, the specific focus of restoration work that she had not fully used in 9 years. She felt the scar tissue, the old fault line, the structural damage that had been compensating around its own weakness for years. And she spoke to it in the language that was the only one she'd ever used without thinking, the language of healing, and told it to come right. It took 40 seconds. She didn't have more than 40 seconds, and she knew it, and she pushed harder than she'd ever pushed without careful preparation and felt the cost of that in her own chest, a deep, bone-level exhaustion that dropped over her like a physical weight. Ronan's breath came out of him in a single, sharp exhale. He looked down at her. "You weren't supposed to do that," he said. His voice was very low. "No." She stepped back and had to catch herself on the edge of the table because her legs had gone temporarily unreliable. But it worked. He reached out and took her arm. Steady, automatic, as if preventing her from falling was the most natural extension of the moment. And his eyes were doing something she didn't have a category for. He looked at her the way you looked at something that had just changed the shape of what you understood to be possible. The door came open. The next 2 hunters were better than the first 4. That was Leora's immediate, clear-eyed assessment as they came through the remains of the door in a staggered entry. One high, one low, forcing Ronan to commit to one angle or the other. They had heard the first four go down and they'd adjusted their approach, which meant they were adaptive as well as trained, which was a worse combination. Ronan went for the high entry because the high entry was the kill angle and he moved toward danger rather than away from it. And Lyora, running purely on the adrenaline because the gift's use had stripped her reserve capacity down to almost nothing, took the blade in her left hand and put herself to the right, where the low entry couldn't recover quickly enough to account for a target that had moved. The fight was faster than the first one. Ronan was faster. She could feel the difference in the way he moved, the right side no longer compensating, the full range of what he was without the limitation. He was genuinely terrifying, and she was watching from 4 feet away. And she stored that away as information rather than fear, because fear was only useful when it was actionable. And right now, the only actionable thing was staying on her feet and staying out of his way. The sixth hunter, the coordinator, the one who had been outside, came in after his unit was already down, and he came in angry rather than tactical, which was the mistake. Ronan put him on the floor in 11 seconds. Then there was silence again. Absolute silence except for Lyora's breathing and Ronan's breathing and the creak of the old cabin in the post-storm wind. 6 hunters. All down, none dead. She noted that, filed it away. He hadn't killed them. He'd had the opportunity and the capability, and he hadn't. Ronan stood in the center of the cabin with blood on his hands and his expression completely closed, looking at her. "Your wound," he said. "My wound is fine. It's open. I'm aware." She looked down at the spreading stain at her left side. "It's not arterial, it's just the stitching pulling. I can manage it." "You burned your reserves." She didn't answer that directly, because yes, she had, and they both knew it. The gift's use at that level, without preparation, left a debt that the body collected with extreme punctuality. She could feel it already, the deep exhaustion that went past muscles and into something more fundamental. "We still need to leave," she said. "This was one unit. There will be more." "Yes." He looked at the fallen hunters. His jaw was tight. "These men are council operatives. When they don't report back, they send more. I know." She began moving toward the pack they'd half-assembled before the attack, trying to assess what still needed to go in it and what they'd have to leave. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. "How fast can you move if I'm slowing you down?" "You're not slowing me down." "Ronan, be honest with me. I burned my reserves and my wound is open and the terrain is going to be brutal. At what pace can you move without losing me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not losing you," he said, and his voice carried the quality of a statement that was not up for discussion, not from a place of dominance, but from a place of decision. A decision that had apparently been made sometime in the last 40 minutes and was not reversing itself. She looked back at him. "We move at your pace," he said. "We move together. That's what we do." Something in her chest did that complicated thing again, the between the ribs thing, the one that happened when someone demonstrated by simple action rather than complex reassurance that they meant what they said. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. She went back to packing. He went to reinforce what remained of the door for long enough to give them the window they needed, and they worked in parallel, quick and quiet and without wasting motion. And in 20 minutes they were at the secondary exit under the floor, packs on, the cabin abandoned behind them. The crawl space was low and cold and smelled of old earth, and it emptied out behind the woodpile into a narrow corridor between 2 enormous pines, where the snow was compressed enough by the overhang to give them solid footing. Ronan came out first, checked the angle of the slope and the position of the shadows, and then held out his hand for her pack to lift it while she cleared the exit. She didn't need the help. She took it anyway. They moved into the trees and the mountain closed around them, and behind them the cabin sat quiet, with its 6 unconscious hunters and its broken door and the cooling evidence of a fight that had already changed the shape of things. Above, somewhere on the ridge, Lyora felt rather than heard the pulse of communication. Wolf sense, long range, the kind that happened at a frequency below sound. A signal being sent, a report being made. She walked closer to Ronan's shoulder, not from fear but from the tactical reality of 2 people moving through hostile terrain who needed to stay within arm's reach of each other. He didn't comment on it. He adjusted his stride to hers without discussion. The trees swallowed them whole. They had been walking for 4 hours when the cold broke Leora open. Not her body. Her body was managing, the healer's training that had made her familiar with her own limits, allowing her to work right up to the edge without crossing it. What broke was something she hadn't expected, something that 9 years of captivity and 3 days of running and 1 morning of fighting had apparently been building toward in the way that pressure built behind ice, slow and structural and invisible, right up until it wasn't. They had stopped at a rocky outcropping that offered a windbreak and a sightline back down the slope. Standard tactical rest, Ronan choosing the position with the automatic competence of someone who had been doing this for years. And Leora sat with her back against the rock and let herself feel the exhaustion fully for the first time, and something in that full feeling unlocked something else. Ronan was sitting 2 feet away, scanning the tree line below, and he was a large warm presence against the cold and the wind, and she was so tired, and for the first time in 9 years, she was not alone in a hostile space, and that was the thing that undid her. Not the wound or the fear or the fight, just that, not being alone. She didn't cry, she was past crying, or maybe the suppressants had taken that along with everything else. What happened was quieter than crying, a long, slow exhale that kept going past the point where breathing ended, as if she was releasing something she'd been holding since she was 12 years old. Ronan looked at her. He didn't say anything, he didn't move closer or move away. He just looked at her with those dark, absolutely direct eyes, and then he reached into the pack and produced the dried meat and hard biscuit from his rations and held half of it out to her. She took it. They ate in silence, and the mountain held still around them, and the cold was ferocious, and the tree cover below them showed no movement, and for a few minutes it was simply 2 people eating on a rock in the frozen wilderness, which was not safety, but was its own category of something. "They'll send a second unit within 24 hours, Ronan said. "I know. There's a way station 3 days northeast if we push hard. Neutral territory. The Council's authority doesn't extend past the Halvern Ridge. 3 days pushing hard when I'm not at full capacity." She did the arithmetic without self-pity. 2.5 days if you carry the heavier pack and set the pace. "I'll carry the heavier pack," he said, as if she'd simply made an observation rather than a proposal. She looked at him sideways. "You're going to be very difficult to argue with, aren't you?" Something in the corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of the memory of one. "So I've been told." Leora looked back at the tree line, feeling the cold in her face and the ache in her side and the deep residual exhaustion of the gift's use. And she thought about the council hunters waking up in the cabin below and the second unit being assembled, and the 3 days of hard terrain between here and anything resembling safety. She thought about Mira. She thought about all of it, all at once, the full weight of the position she was in, and she held it the way you held something that was too heavy to carry indefinitely, but had to be carried for a while longer. 3 days, she said. 3 days, Ronan agreed. He stood, shouldered the heavier pack with the ease of his restored right side. And she caught the moment he registered that restoration, the fractional pause of a man taking stock of what had been given back to him. He didn't comment on it, but he looked at her briefly with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but something older and more precise than gratitude. "Can you move?" he said. "Yes," Leora said, and stood. They moved back into the trees, single file, Ronan ahead and slightly left where he could shield her from the worst of the wind without making it a performance of protection. Behind them, the outcropping was empty. Below them, somewhere in the mountain, the council hunters were beginning to stir. And somewhere ahead, in the frozen white silence of the Velthar range, something was shifting. In the council's network. In the intelligence being assembled about 2 fugitives moving northeast. In the slow and terrible machinery of power that had exiled one and enslaved the other, and now, for the first time, was going to have to contend with them together. The cold was absolute, and the sky was the white of a blank page, and they walked into it without looking back. The cold was absolute, and the sky was the white of a blank page, and they walked into it without looking back. The first day passed in the rhythm of survival. Step and breathe and step. The mechanical repetition that replaced thinking when thinking was a luxury the body couldn't afford. Ronan set the pace with the kind of instinctive calibration that came from years of solo movement through hostile terrain. Fast enough to generate heat, slow enough to sustain over distance, adjusted every hour with a sideways glance at Leora that was not checking on her so much as reading data. She recognized the assessment and didn't resent it. It was the same thing she did with patients: observe, adjust, don't announce the observation. Her wound held. The cold was paradoxically useful for that, acting as a natural suppressant for the inflammation, and she had redressed it at their first rest stop with supplies from the pack, her hands efficient and impersonal. The exhaustion from the gift's use persisted, a deep, structural tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. But it was the manageable kind, the kind that lived below the threshold of impairment. She had felt it before in the healer's ward at Ashvale, in the early years before she'd learned to regulate the output, before she'd understood that the gift had a cost, and that she was the one who paid it. She had never used it at that intensity before. Not in 9 years, not even once. She didn't tell Ronan that. He knew anyway. She was increasingly aware that Ronan Vale knew a significant number of things she didn't tell him, reading them from the air around her with the same quiet precision he applied to territorial markers and weather patterns and the body language of enemies. It should have been unsettling. It wasn't. She was still cataloging why. They sheltered the first night in a natural depression beneath an overhang of rock. Out of the wind, a fire built small and low and screened by Ronan with a flat stone angled to reflect the heat inward and disperse the smoke horizontally rather than vertically where it would be visible against the sky. He built it with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything physical, and she watched the method and memorized it without comment. They ate from the rations and they slept in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours watch, trading without discussion. When it was her watch and he slept, she sat with her back against the rock and the iron blade across her knees and watched the darkness between the trees. Twice she heard movement, animals, both times, the specific quality of movement that was just living creatures going about their business in the dark, rather than the deliberate trained silence of hunters. She noted both and let them pass. When Ronan's hand came down lightly on her shoulder to take the watch at the 4-hour mark, she didn't startle. She had felt him surface from sleep 10 seconds before he moved. "Anything?" he asked. 2 deer, 1 fox, no wolves. He settled into the watch position and she lay down, and she was asleep in under a minute, which was possibly the most profound evidence of trust she had displayed in 9 years. The second day was harder. The terrain above the Halvern approach was steep and broken, the kind of landscape that punished inattention. Ice-coated rock beneath deceptive snow cover, sudden drops concealed by overhang, the wind channeled by the valley walls into currents that hit with enough force to knock a person sideways if they weren't braced for it. Ronan navigated it with the ease of someone who had memorized this ground over 2 years of patrolling it, his hand coming back at intervals to indicate footing without ceremony. A gesture so practical and consistent that she stopped registering it as a gesture and started registering it as information. It was mid-morning of the second day when she heard the second unit. They were better at silence than the first. That was her first assessment, drawn from the absence of what she should have been hearing: bird movement, small animal scatter, the environmental disruption that preceded human presence in forest terrain. The silence itself was the tell. Too even, too sustained, the silence of an environment that had registered something large and deliberate and was holding its breath. "Ronan!" She kept her voice below the wind. He stopped. "Above us. Northeast slope." She tilted her head toward the angle she'd read the silence from. "They came around the ridge. They're not following our trail. They're cutting ahead of it." A pause. She watched his face process this. The rapid, invisible calculation of someone working through tactical geometry at speed. "They know where we're going," he said. Not a question. "They know about the Halvern Way station. Someone in your network." "I don't have a network, not anymore." His voice was flat, but a specific kind of flat, the kind that covered something sharp. "Someone in the Council's intelligence has the old files, the routes I used in the first years of exile." He looked up at the ridge. "They're not trying to catch us. They're trying to funnel us." "Into what?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted. And then he said, "There's a fortress in the mountain, the old Valdris stronghold, abandoned for 40 years, or so the public record states. He turned to look at her directly. The council has been using it as a covert detention facility for at least the last decade. I found evidence of it 2 years ago, before I went dark. I didn't act on it because I had no allies and no leverage. A pause. If they're funneling us north, they're funneling us toward Valdres. Leora thought about this carefully. A detention facility. A place where things happen that the council doesn't want attributed to the council. His voice carried no particular inflection on this, which was in itself a form of inflection. She looked at the slope above and the slope below and the terrain ahead, running the options with the same stripped-down survival logic she'd used at the cabin. The second unit was above and ahead. Behind them, the first unit's reinforcements were probably 12 to 18 hours back. The Halvern way station was no longer a safe destination. They were being herded. "What's inside Valdres?" she asked. "I don't know the current configuration. When I found evidence of it, the records suggested it could hold 30 to 40 wolves under guard." A beat. "The council members who run it include Councillor Davin Soar." The name hit her like cold water. "Soar. You know him. He visited Ashvale twice in the 9 years I was there. He was the one who established the Omega collection protocols that Warden Drace operated under." She paused. "He's the architect of the Capture and Catalog program. The restoration gifts." Another pause. "He knows about me. He's known about me for years," Drace reported to him directly. "Then Soar isn't just here to recapture me," Ronan said. "He's here for you too." "He was always here for me." She heard her own voice come out very level and was quietly proud of it. "He just didn't know where I was until now." The silence between them had a specific weight. "We can't run around them," Ronan said. "Not with this terrain and not with your condition. They'll have the high ground before we can gain it. We can't run back." "No." "Then we don't run." She met his eyes. "If they're funneling us to Valdres, let them funnel us. But on our terms and our timing, not theirs." Ronan looked at her with those dark, measuring eyes. "You want to go into the fortress deliberately. I want to go into the fortress before they're ready for us to arrive. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "They're expecting frightened fugitives trying to avoid capture. They're not expecting us to choose the approach." The wind came through the valley wall with a sound like tearing fabric, and she watched Ronan make the calculation. She could see it in the stillness of his face, the quality of his silence. And she watched him reach the conclusion that she had already reached, which was that there were no good options, and this was the least bad one, and that it required trusting her judgment, and that he was apparently going to do that. "The eastern face of Valdres has a drainage channel built into the foundation wall," he said. "It was in the original construction records I found, large enough for a person to pass through if it hasn't been modified." "Then that's our door." She adjusted the pack on her shoulders. "How long to reach the eastern face from current position?" 6 hours at this terrain." 5, she said. "We move faster." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth again. That ghost of a smile. "We move faster," he agreed. They turned northeast, directly toward the thing they were supposed to be fleeing from, and they moved. Valdres was not what she had expected, which meant she had expected wrong. She had built a picture from what Ronan had told her. Abandoned stronghold, covert facility, 40 years of official neglect. And she had imagined something deteriorating, something that wore its secret function in the looseness of its upkeep. Instead, as they came around the eastern face in the hour before full dark, she saw a structure that was perfectly maintained. Its stones fitted so tightly that the join lines were barely visible under the snow, its towers intact, the few lights showing at the narrow windows amber and steady. It was built into the mountain itself, not against it, but into it, the rear walls incorporating the living rock of the peak, which meant it had exactly one exposed face, and that face was the eastern wall she was currently crouched against in the shadow of the drainage channel that was, thank whatever passed for luck in frozen mountains, exactly as described. Unmodified, approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, cut into the foundation stone at ground level. The iron grate that had presumably covered it long since rusted away. "Someone's going to notice that," Leora said quietly, nodding at the gap. "Someone already noticed it and decided it was too small to be a threat," Ronan said. Most people are right about that. Most people. You're not most people. She looked at the gap, assessed it, and went in first because she was smaller, and because sometimes being smaller was not a disadvantage. The drainage channel was dark and close and smelled of cold stone and old water, and something biological she chose not to identify. She moved through it on her elbows and knees, with her pack dragging at her back and the iron blade in her right hand, her face close enough to the stone floor that she could feel the cold radiating off it against her cheek. And she thought with remarkable calm about the specifics of what she was doing, which was voluntarily entering a covert detention facility, controlled by the man responsible for 9 years of her captivity. Voluntary, she noted. I chose this. That's different. It was different. It mattered that it was different. She came out into a low basement space, storage by the smell and the rough shelving visible in the thin light that bled down from a trapdoor in the ceiling. Ronan followed her through the channel 30 seconds later, soundless and compact despite his size, and they crouched together in the dark and oriented. The trapdoor leads to the main storage level, he said against her ear, his voice a bare thread of sound. Above that, the main hall. Holding cells would be in the lower north wing. That's standard fortress conversion. How many guards? At minimum. 2 at the main gate, 1 rotation through the cells, 1 above on the east tower at this hour. He paused. This is an unofficial facility. They run it lean. Fewer people means fewer who know about it. So 8 to 12 total. Yes. We're looking for what exactly? She kept her voice at the same bare thread. Intelligence, a way out, leverage? We need to know what Soar knows and what he's planning. If he has active orders regarding you, the restoration gift, the catalog status, that information changes what we can do next. He paused. And there's something else. She waited. The files. The Council keeps physical records of the Omega catalog in one facility off the Council's central network, specifically to prevent a digital breach. I believe those records are here. His voice was completely controlled, which was how she knew the next part was significant. If we can reach them. Those records are evidence, Leora said slowly. Those records are the names of every Omega who has been collected, cataloged, and assigned under SOAR's protocols, dating back 15 years. A beat. Including the ones who were never officially recorded anywhere else, including Ashvale. She felt something shift in her chest, deep and tectonic. Including Mira. The name came out of her before she could contain it. In the dark basement of an enemy fortress, with the cold pressing in from the stone walls, Mira's name was suddenly the most important thing she had said in 3 days. If those records show Asheville's intake protocols, they show illegal capture and detention, Ronan said quietly. Under even the Council's own charter, forced collection of minors is a capital offense, Leora finished. They've been doing it for 15 years and those records exist and they're here. Yes, she breathed. That's what we need, she said. That's what we need. They went up through the trapdoor. The main storage level was empty. The main hall above that was not. They heard the voices before they reached the top of the interior stairs. Multiple voices, the kind of volume that suggested a gathering rather than casual conversation. The acoustics of the stone corridor carrying the sound with the clarity of an architectural accident. Leora pressed herself against the wall beside the stair opening and listened. She identified 6 distinct vocal signatures. Counting the guards outside, that accounted for most of the facility's probable personnel. Arrived 2 hours ago, one voice was saying. Male, older, carrying the specific register of authority held so long it had become unconscious. The first unit confirmed the contact. They're moving northeast. Toward the way station. A second voice, younger, sharper. If they reach Halvern, they won't. The first voice again, and something in the absolute certainty of it made the back of Leora's neck prickle with specific recognition. She had heard that voice. Not here, not recently, but in the healer's ward at Ashvale, years ago, speaking to Warden Drace in the tone of someone reviewing inventory. The second unit is ahead of them. They have nowhere to go. Devon Soar. She pressed her hand flat against the stone wall and let the recognition move through her without reaction, because reaction was expensive and she couldn't afford it. Ronan's hand came to rest on her shoulder, brief, grounding, entirely voluntary on his part and hers. What about the girl? A third voice, this one carrying a different quality, careful, measured, the voice of someone who had learned to be careful around the second voice. A pause from Soar. The restoration gift is intact, 9 years of suppression and field conditions, and she still used it at full activation level. The pulse was recorded on our instruments at the cabin site. A pause that carried something satisfied in it. She's more powerful than the early assessments indicated. Much more. And Vale? Vale is a complication, but a manageable one. The Council wants him contained, not eliminated. There are questions about the crown succession that his existence answers in ways that are, another pause, useful, for now. Leora looked at Ronan in the dimness of the corridor. His face was completely still. Bring them in, Soar said. When the second unit delivers them, I want them separated immediately. The girl goes to the catalog facility. I'll oversee that personally. Vale goes to the secure level. A beat. And make sure the council representative understands that the restoration gift is not to be interfered with. That gift is worth more to the council's medical program than everything else in this facility combined. The catalog facility. Leora had a very clear image, suddenly, of what that meant. A room, instruments, the kind of systematic extraction of a person's most intimate biology that was dressed up in the language of medicine and science and program value. The kind of thing that had been done to other gifted Omegas for 15 years and had never been named for what it was because the people who ran it were the people who decided what things were named. She looked at Ronan. He looked at her. The records, she mouthed. He tilted his head north, the direction he'd indicated earlier for the holding cells, and presumably whatever served as an administrative space in this facility. She nodded. They moved north through the interior corridor, away from the voices, close to the wall, and the fortress held its breath around them. Eek. The administrative room was the third door from the north end of the corridor. She identified it from the quality of the lock, heavier than the others, and the smell of lamp oil and old paper that bled under the door. Ronan had the lock open in 90 seconds, with tools from his pack that she didn't ask about and he didn't explain. Inside, a table, chairs, oil lamp burning low, and along the far wall a bank of iron-bound chests with classification markings stamped into the metal. She went directly to the chests. Ronan went to the door and positioned himself where he could watch the corridor. The chests were locked, but not elaborately. These were files, not weapons, secured against casual access rather than deliberate forced entry, and her hands found the mechanism and worked it open with the automatic patience of someone who had spent years picking similar locks when the wardens weren't looking, because the only way to know what was planned for you was to read the plans. Inside, files. Dozens of them, bound in oilcloth, labeled with dates and pack designations, and a numbering system she didn't immediately recognize. She found Asheville in under 2 minutes. The file was thick. Much thicker than it should have been, if the only Omega healers at Asheville were the ones officially acknowledged in council records. She opened it and looked at the intake logs, running her finger down the column of names, dates, ages. Mira Voss, age 9. Intake date, 4 years ago. Her chest closed. 9 years old. Mira had been 9 years old when they brought her in. She had been in Asheville for 4 years, which meant she had arrived 3 years before Leora escaped, which meant Leora did the calculation with the precise, merciless clarity of a healer who was used to knowing the numbers, even when the numbers were terrible. Mira was now 13 years old and had been in the compound for 4 of those 13 years. The file listed Mira's gift designation, emergent, classification pending. That meant the gift had been identified but not fully assessed. That meant they hadn't yet done to Mira what they did to Omegas whose gifts were fully classified. Not yet. Leora took the entire Asheville file, folded it inside her coat against her body, and kept moving through the chest. She found the main catalog in the second chest, the master record, 16 years of documented collections, names and locations and gift classifications and assignment records, the whole systematic architecture of what Davin Soar had built. Her hands were steady as she transferred it to her pack. She had the disassociated calm of someone who had moved past the feeling part of a thing into the doing part, and she had always been better at the doing part anyway. Leora, Ronan's voice from the doorway, very quiet. She closed the chest. I have it. We have a problem. She turned. He was looking down the corridor toward the main hall, and his body had the particular quality of stillness that she had learned in the last 2 days meant that the situation had changed significantly. How many? All of them, he said. Someone heard the lock. They're coming this way. She assessed the room. One door. The one Ronan was occupying. One window. Narrow, high on the wall, the kind designed for light, not egress. The records in her pack, irreplaceable. No exits. Then we go through them, she said. Ronan turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something that might have been not fear, nothing so ordinary as fear, but its more sophisticated cousin. The recognition of high stakes. Leora Sate. We go through them, she said. I have those records, and what's in them will end Soar's program. If we run, and they take this pack, I know. Then we go through them. His jaw set. He turned back to the corridor. Stay behind me until I call you forward. I'm not waiting in the back until I call you forward, he said, and his voice had that quality again. The one that was not a command, but a decision. Because you have that pack, and that pack has to survive this. That's the only reason. She closed her mouth. When I say forward, he said, come forward. When you say forward, she agreed. The footsteps in the corridor reached the door. Ronan stepped into the opening like a mountain deciding to move, and the noise that followed was not like the cabin fight. The cabin fight had been close and quiet and over fast. This was different. This was the full, terrible weight of what Ronan Vale actually was without a bad right side, and without the limitation of a small space, and against men who had not prepared themselves for what they were walking toward. Leora stood behind the door and listened and waited and pressed her hand flat against the records through the coat and held completely still, and she counted. 4 down by the sound of it. Then a voice she recognized, Soar's voice, the careful authority of it, from further up the corridor. Hold. Hold. Bring the Omega out first. She has the files. They know about the files. Someone had read the intake list. Someone had seen the Ashvale file was gone and understood immediately what it meant. Forward, Ronan said. She came through the doorway. The corridor was chaos. 4 council operatives down, 2 more hanging back, and Ronan between her and all of it with blood on his hands and his face absolutely closed. And at the far end of the corridor, lit by the amber spill of the main hall behind him, stood a man she hadn't seen in 4 years but would have recognized in absolute darkness. Davin Soar was older than she remembered. Not physically. The years had been gentle with his body, the careful preservation of someone with access to good medicine and no shortage of resources. What was older was something in his eyes, the specific, calculating age of someone who had spent a long time building something and was now watching it become threatened and was deciding with great precision what to do about it. He looked at Leora across the length of the corridor with the expression of a man looking at an asset. Leora. He said her name with the particular weight of someone who had been tracking it for years. You've been extraordinarily difficult to find. I had reasons to stay hidden. You had fears, he said, and his voice was kind in the way that things are kind when the kindness is a tool. But you misunderstood the program. The catalog isn't punishment. It's protection. Your gift is rare. It needs to be preserved, studied, used for what you need it for, she said, not for what I choose. Something flickered in his eyes. Choice is a complicated concept for someone in your position. No, Leora said. It's actually very simple. She reached into her coat and took out the Ashvale file, and she held it up so he could see it clearly, and she watched his face change. Mira Voss, she said, age 9 at intake, 4 years in your compound, emergent gift, classification pending. Her voice was absolutely level. If I can read this file, other people can read this file, and this file is one of hundreds, and I have all of them. Soar's face had gone very still. Intake of minors under age 10 is a capital offense under Council Charter Article 14, Leora continued. Forced collection of designated gifts without consent is a violation of the treaty articles that created the Council's authority. You know that. You wrote some of those articles yourself. A pause. This facility, these records, what you've been doing, it doesn't just end your program, it ends you. The silence in the corridor was enormous. Then Soar did something she hadn't fully prepared for, which was to smile. Extraordinary, he said quietly, and the word carried genuine appreciation, which was somehow worse than anger. I was told you were remarkable when Drace first identified you. I didn't fully understand the scope of it until now. He looked at her with the expression of a man reconsidering a calculation. You understand that the two of you leaving here with those records isn't something I can allow. You don't have the people left to stop us, Ronan said. His voice was quiet. I don't need people. Soar reached into his coat and produced something that Leora identified, with the specific, cold recognition of a healer who knew what things did to bodies, as a suppression injector. Medical grade. Military concentration. The girl's gift is the variable that changes your equation veil. Without it, you're an exiled king with a bad history and no allies. He looked at Leora. I don't need to kill her. I just need to take that variable off the board. Leora looked at the injector. She looked at Ronan. She looked at Soar. And she made the decision that she had been walking toward, she realized, since she had opened the door of the cabin 3 days ago. She didn't wait for Ronan to move first. She didn't wait for a better moment. She stepped forward directly toward Davin Soar and the injector in his hand, and she let every suppressed instinct she had been containing for 3 days come fully, finally online. The gift rose in her like a tide coming in. Not the focused, targeted restoration she had used on Ronan's injury, not the controlled deployment she had trained herself to maintain, but the full original force of it, the thing she had been keeping underwater since she was 12 years old, the thing that Soar had been cataloging from a distance and had never actually been in the room with. It came out as light, not metaphorical light, actual light, the pale blue-white light of deep cellular restoration radiating from her hands and her face and the space around her body, and it hit the stone walls and the iron-bound chests and the men in the corridor and Soar's face with the quality of something ancient and fundamentally unkind to things that cause damage to living creatures. The two operatives who had been hanging back went to their knees, not from injury, from the biological imperative of a restoration pulse at that magnitude, which overrode voluntary motor function in anyone within its radius who was carrying unhealed damage, and everyone in that corridor was carrying unhealed damage. Soar staggered back. The injector fell from his hand. Ronan, who was also within the radius, and who also went to one knee, briefly, before recovering, looked at her from the floor with an expression that she would think about for a very long time. Then he got up, crossed to Soar in 3 strides, and the counselor went down in a way that was going to result in a very significant headache when he woke up. The light faded. Leora stood in the middle of the corridor of a fortress in a frozen mountain with her hands still glowing faintly at the edges, the pack on her back, the records against her chest. She was trembling, not from fear but from the magnitude of what she had just expended, the gift pulling its cost from her in real time with an efficiency that was beginning to make her vision tunnel slightly at the edges. Ronan was at her side before she registered he'd moved. His hand came to her arm, steadying, immediate. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes." She blinked hard, pushing the tunnel vision back by sheer will. "Yes, I can walk." "The gate guards will have seen the light." "I know." "We have 30 seconds." "I know." She looked at him. The corridor was full of people who weren't standing up anymore, and the records were in her pack, and Soar was on the floor with his very careful authority temporarily neutralized, and somewhere out there, the gate guards were running toward the source of a light they had no framework for understanding. "The drainage channel," she said. "Too slow." "The main gate," she said. Ronan looked at her. "2 gate guards," she said. "You can take 2 gate guards in your sleep." The ghost of a smile again, more visible this time. "I can take 2 gate guards in my sleep." "Then let's go." They went, running now, through the main hall and toward the front of the fortress, and behind them the corridor was chaos, and ahead of them the gate was the only door, and Leora ran with her hand pressed against the pack, and the records that held Mira's name, and she ran like someone who had decided, completely and irrevocably, that she was never going to let anything be taken from her again. The gate guards saw them coming. Ronan was already moving, and from the corridor behind them, rising through the stone like a slow tide, the sound of Davin Soar's voice. Not Soar anymore, not the careful authority, but something underneath it, something stripped of its composure, calling orders into the dark. They hit the gate at full speed. The cold outside was absolute, and the mountain was dark, and somewhere in the black distance between here and everything that came next, the second unit of council hunters was waiting. Except now Soar was down, and the records were in Leora's pack, and the gate was behind them, and the variables had changed in ways that no one inside that fortress had been prepared for. Ronan pulled her left at the base of the approach road, into the tree cover, and they ran in the dark with the cold screaming around them, and the fortress lights blazing behind them, and Leora's hands were still glowing faintly at the edges, fading slowly, the last light of something that had been kept underground for 9 years, finally finding air. Above them, from the eastern tower, a signal horn split the night in two. The signal horn split the mountain night and kept going. One long note, then two short, then one long again. The code that meant escaped prisoners, pursue immediately. And Leora ran with her lungs burning and her hand still throwing off faint traces of light that she couldn't fully suppress because the gift didn't have an off switch. Not when it had been running at that magnitude. Not when her body was still cycling down from the expenditure. She ran anyway. Ronan was ahead of her and to the left, moving through the tree cover with a speed that she matched through sheer refusal to do otherwise, his dark coat dissolving into the dark trees and reappearing with the rhythm of his stride, a fixed point in the chaos behind them that she kept her eyes on because fixed points were what you needed when everything else was variable. The pursuit was immediate. She could hear it, not the careful silence of trained hunters conserving their presence, but the urgent, coordinated noise of a facility that had just lost its two most valuable acquisitions and was reacting with the controlled panic of an operation whose careful architecture was suddenly full of holes. Voices, movement, the creak of equipment. She counted at least 6 distinct sound sources. "Northeast," Ronan said over his shoulder, his voice entirely even despite the pace. "There's a gully 300 meters out. Running water breaks the scent trail." Running water in this temperature? Spring-fed. The cold slows it but doesn't freeze it solid until January. A pause. "We're 10 days from January." She processed this and ran. The trees were dense and the snow underfoot was unpacked, slower than the compressed trail they'd been following, her feet breaking through the crust with each stride in a way that required constant micro-adjustment of balance, which was expensive when she was already running low on reserves. She could feel the gift's debt collecting with the methodical patience of a creditor who knew she wasn't going anywhere. Her vision had stabilized, but the edges were soft in a way she was monitoring with the part of her brain that had learned to monitor her own condition the way she monitored patients. Still functional, she told herself. Still functional is enough. The gully appeared as a dark cut in the white slope ahead, and Ronan went down into it without breaking stride, his feet finding purchase in the tumbled rocks at the bank. And she followed him in and felt the cold of the spring water hit her boots with a shock that was startlingly useful. The cold was sharp and clarifying, and it moved through the fog at the edges of her vision like a hand clearing steam off glass. They ran in the water for 200 meters, the creek bed narrow and the rocks uneven, and the cold and ongoing systematic assault on everything below the knee. Then Ronan came up the left bank, tested the overhang of a rock shelf above with both hands, and pulled himself up. He turned immediately and reached down for her. She took his hand and he lifted her. Not assisted lift, not the gesture of someone maintaining plausible deniability about the amount of effort involved, but an actual, full lift that brought her up and over the rock shelf in one motion, his grip entirely matter-of-fact about the weight and the terrain and the urgency. She landed beside him. They pressed against the rock face and listened. The pursuit sounds were still coming, but they were directional. East-northeast, trending away from the gully, following the track they'd left before hitting the water. The scent break was working. She could hear the sounds spreading out as the trackers began to lose the thread, the coordinated pursuit fragmenting into individual searchers casting wider circles. "How long?" she breathed. 20 minutes before they work back to the gully," he said. His mouth was very close to her ear in the dark. "Then they find the water, and they know. 20 minutes to put more distance on them." 20 minutes, he confirmed. They moved. The night was the longest she had experienced since leaving Ashevale, which was itself a significant claim. They put 6 miles between themselves and Valdres in the 4 hours before dawn, moving without rest at a pace that Leora maintained through a combination of training, stubbornness, and the occasional firm application of the healer's knowledge of her own body. The specific knowledge of exactly how close she was to the various thresholds of impairment and exactly how much she could push past the warning signals before the warnings became instructions. It was not comfortable knowledge to have, but it was useful. The pursuit fell back incrementally, not because the hunters gave up. She didn't flatter herself about that, but because the gully and the darkness and Ronan's navigation of terrain that he had spent 2 years memorizing had given them a lead that was compounding with each mile. By the time the gray pre-dawn started pulling the mountain shapes back out of the dark, she estimated they had at least 4 hours on any ground pursuit. 4 hours was not safety. 4 hours was a margin. "We need to stop," Ronan said. "I know," she said. "Your wound." "I know," she said again, not irritably, but with the directness of someone who had been tracking the same information and had arrived at the same conclusion and didn't need it narrated. "Find me something with walls." What he found was a rockfall, a place where a section of the upper slope had given way years ago, creating a jumbled chaos of enormous boulders that had settled into an accidental architecture of small enclosed spaces. He led her through the outer layer of it with the confidence of someone who had mapped this formation before, and in the interior, where the boulders were the size of small houses and had fallen together into a shape that was essentially a roofed cavity, he stopped. It was out of the wind, the ground was clear of snow. The boulder roof was solid enough that no precipitation had reached it, the surface instead a deep, compressed layer of old pine needles, surprisingly soft. Leora sat down. The word "sat" was technically accurate but significantly understated what happened, which was that her legs executed a controlled failure and deposited her onto the pine needles in a way that she directed as much as possible, and then stopped directing entirely. She heard Ronan sit beside her, not across from her, not at the tactical watching the entrance distance, beside her, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and she felt the warmth of his body heat through both their coats in the cold, enclosed dark of the rockfall cavity. She did not move away. She noted this about herself and then filed it without comment. "Let me look at the wound," he said. "It's manageable." "Leora." She turned and looked at him in the dim light. He looked back, and his face in the gray pre-dawn had the quality of things seen very clearly because all the peripheral distraction was gone. No complexity, no armor, just the direct, careful reality of someone asking her to let him help. She lifted her coat. He worked in silence, methodical and gentle. The same hands she had watched manage a dozen situations that required steadiness. The herb preparation in the cabin, the lockpick in the fortress, the sustained precision of the fight in the corridor. He cleaned the wound, repacked it with supplies from their increasingly depleted medical stores, wrapped it tighter than before. "The infection is controlled," he said. "The re-tearing from the run is surface. It'll hold." "I know." "You don't have to keep saying that." "I say it because it's true." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to fall apart. I need you to trust that." Something moved in his expression. "I do trust that." "Then stop announcing my condition like a status report." A pause. Then, unexpectedly, the actual smile. Not the ghost of one, not the corner of the mouth suggestion of one, but a real smile, brief and genuine and changing his entire face, and she understood suddenly why it was so rare. It made him look like something other than a mountain, and she thought he probably couldn't afford to look like anything other than a mountain most of the time. The smile lasted 3 seconds, and then it was gone, and he was looking at the entrance to the cavity with his default expression of contained watchfulness. But she had seen it. She filed that too. "The records," he said. "We need to talk about what we do with them." I've been thinking about that. She pulled the pack onto her knees and checked the integrity of the sealed bundle inside. Intact, dry, the oilcloth wrapping doing its job. The records alone aren't enough. We need them seen, by the right people, in the right context, in a way that SOAR can't suppress. The Council controls the primary channels. Then we don't use the primary channels. She looked at him. There are independent voices in the wolf communities, packs outside the Council's direct authority, the Halvern territories, the Greywood Federation, the packs north of the KL Ridge. They've been operating in tension with the Iron Council for years. They'd receive evidence of SOAR's program with very different hands than anyone inside the Council's structure. Getting to any of them from here? I know the geography. I spent 9 years reading every map and document the wardens left within reach of the healer's ward. A pause. The Greywood Federation has a contact point at Mirath, a border way station that operates as a neutral communication hub. It's 5 days south, not 3 days northeast like the Halvern route. 5 days south takes us back toward Valdris. South of Valdris, south of different valley, different approach. She met his eyes. SOAR will expect us to run away. He won't expect us to move toward the places where his program can be dismantled. Ronan was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those dark eyes. You planned this in the fortress. I planned this in the gully when I had 2 minutes to think. She paused. And some of it in the healer's ward at Ashvale over the last 9 years, when I was imagining every possible way this could go if I ever got out. Another pause, quieter. I had a lot of time to imagine. The silence that followed that was different from the others, heavier and warmer somehow, which she would have said was a contradiction if she hadn't been sitting in it. 5 days south, Ronan said. With rest, she said, I need 6 hours. 6 hours. I'll wake at the 6-hour mark. I know you will. He settled back against the boulder behind them, and his shoulder stayed against hers. Sleep. She slept. Eat. Day in. She woke at exactly the 6-hour mark, as she had known she would, to a changed quality of light and the smell of food. Ronan had used the small folding iron pot to heat water and rehydrate 2 portions of the dried ration with pine needle tea, and the smell of something warm in the cold air hit her with a force that was disproportionate to what it actually was. She ate. Her body received the food with profound relief and began immediately applying it to the considerable repair list it had been accumulating. The gift, Ronan said, not looking at her, looking at the entrance. What you did in the corridor? Yes. I've never seen anything like that. Neither have I, she said. Not from the outside, anyway. When it's running at that level, I don't see it the same way you do. I feel it. She paused. It's been that strong since I was young. That's why they kept me suppressed. A restoration pulse at that magnitude in an uncontrolled setting could... She thought about how to finish this. It overwhelms voluntary motor function in anyone carrying unhealed damage, which in a population that trains through pain and carries chronic injury is everyone, Ronan said. Yes. You're describing a tactical capability. I'm describing a medical phenomenon that has tactical implications when misused. She looked at him directly. That's precisely why SOAR wanted it cataloged and controlled. Because whoever controls a restoration gift, that strong controls the field conditions of any conflict it enters. She paused. He wasn't wrong about the value. He was wrong about who it belonged to. Ronan looked at her then, and the quality of his gaze had something in it that she was finally developing a vocabulary for. Not admiration, not the kind that reduced her to the thing being admired, but the kind of recognition that passed between equals when one of them says something that lands precisely true. It belongs to you, he said. Yes, she said. It does. They left the rockfall as the morning light strengthened and turned south. The next 2 days were different from the days before. Not easier. The terrain south was demanding in the specific cumulative way of mountain travel that didn't have dramatic obstacles so much as endless moderate ones. The kind that didn't stop you but steadily extracted attacks from every joint and muscle. Not safer. They were still in the ranges, still within the theoretical reach of Valdris's hunters, still carrying records that would make them priority targets for anyone in the council's authority structure. But different in the way that things are different when the purpose behind them has clarified. They moved with economy and without wasted motion, and they talked, more than she had expected, more than the tactical necessity of the situation required, the kind of talking that happened when two people who had both spent a long time alone in hostile circumstances discovered that the other person was someone they could think out loud with. She told him about the healer's ward, not the summary version she'd given the first night, the clean, factual sequence of events she'd learned to recite when recitation was required, but the texture of it, the specific details of what 9 years in a place like Asheville did to the interior architecture of a person. The way you learned to want small things because wanting large things was a liability. The way you built a self out of the only materials available, work, competence, the quiet ongoing project of keeping other people's bodies intact when the systems around them were dedicated to making everyone small. He listened without offering commentary or comfort, which was exactly right. She didn't need commentary or comfort. She needed someone to hear it without flinching, without the condescending kindness that minimized the thing by softening it. He heard it without flinching. In return, he told her about the exile. Not the political architecture of it, she'd pieced that together already, but the 7 years. The first months of constant movement, running ahead of hunters he couldn't fight openly because open conflict would have given the council the narrative they wanted, that the exiled king was a dangerous rogue, that the exile was justified, that every wolf who'd been uncertain about the council's action should consider it confirmed. He'd run instead, and the running had cost him something he didn't name directly, but that she understood from the way he said it. The sense of becoming less than what you were by virtue of how long you'd had to make yourself invisible. And then you stopped running, she said. 2 years ago. You built the cabin. I stopped because the running was only survival. The cabin was... He paused, searching for the word with the precision of someone who used language carefully. A declaration. That I was still here. That I hadn't been erased. A declaration to yourself. There was no one else to make it to. She thought about that for a while. Then, there's a difference between survival and life. You built the cabin because you needed the difference. He looked at her sideways with the expression that had started to mean you said something that landed true. Yes. I understand that. She walked for a moment in the rhythm of the terrain. I built it differently. Mine was keeping the gift alive. Not using it, not letting them have it, but keeping it intact. Knowing it was there, under everything they did to suppress it. A pause. That was my cabin. Ronan was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke, it was with the careful precision of someone saying something that had been thought about properly before being said. What you did in that fortress, he said. You knew what it would cost. You used it anyway. For the records. For the records, he agreed. And before that, in the cabin. For me. She didn't answer that directly. There wasn't an answer that was both true and simple, and she had learned to be careful with truths that weren't simple. You needed it, she said finally, and I made a choice. A choice for me. A choice I made, she said. The distinction matters. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the recognition of what she was actually saying. Not I chose to help you, but I chose, for myself, to use the gift, and the choosing was mine. The autonomy of the act, the gift as something she directed, rather than something that was directed on her behalf. Yes, he said quietly, that distinction matters. They walked. They reached the outer boundary of Mirath on the evening of the 4th day, which was a day ahead of the schedule she'd calculated, partly because the terrain had been kinder than expected, and partly because they had found a rhythm of movement that was more efficient than either of them could have achieved alone. Mirath was not impressive from the outside. A cluster of structures at the intersection of 3 valley routes, low-roofed and practical, built for function rather than display. A way station in the truest sense, a place between places, existing to facilitate passage rather than to hold anyone. The lights were amber and low, and there were wolves moving between the structures, 3 or 4 visible from the tree line, their postures relaxed in the way of people going about ordinary business. Neutral ground, Ronan said, assessing. The Greywood Federation enforces that here. No pack affiliations exercised within the boundaries. Council authority has no standing. Then we approach openly. You're sure? We come in with weapons visible but not deployed, records accessible, and a specific request to speak with whoever holds communication authority here. She looked at him. If we come in hiding, we're fugitives. If we come in openly, we're still fugitives, he said. We're fugitives with evidence and a case to make, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth. You keep making that distinction. Because it keeps being true. They came out of the tree line in the last light, walking openly down the approach to Mirath's main structure, and Leora felt the eyes find them immediately. Not hostile, but alert. The attention of wolves who maintain neutral ground by being very clear-eyed about what arrived on it. A man came out to meet them at the way station's outer marker. Large, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who had been managing territorial intersections for long enough to have very few surprises left. He looked at them both with the measuring attention of a person rapidly assessing categories. He stopped when he saw Ronan. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, she assessed. He was a thorough one. But the kind of stop that happened when you recognize something you'd been told could never exist in this location. Ronan Vale, the man said. Kale Morrow, Ronan said. You're older. So are you. The gray-haired man looked at him for a long moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then, slowly, something in his face resolved into a decision. You have your father's look when you've been in the field long enough. I noticed that every time. He looked at Leora. And this is? Leora, she said. I was an Omega healer under the Ashvale protocols. I escaped 11 days ago. Ashvale. Kale Morrow said the word with the specific quality of someone who had heard it in whispers and was now hearing it spoken aloud, in the open, by the person who had lived inside it. You're the third escaped Omega to come through Mirath in the last year. The information hit her like the creek water had hit her boots, sharp and clarifying. There have been others? 2 others, yes, neither of them with... He looked at the pack on her back, and she had the sense he was reading something about her from the way she carried it. With what you appear to be carrying. I have the catalog records, she said. The Iron Council's complete Omega collection files, 15 years. The documentation of Valdris Facility's detention operations. The intake logs for every wolf taken under Davensor's program. She held his gaze. I need to get these to the independent packs. To anyone outside the Council's authority structure who can receive them, verify them, and act on them. Kale Morrow looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he looked at Ronan. The Council put a standing kill order on you 6 years ago, he said to Ronan. Are you aware of that? I assumed, Ronan said, and you walked onto my neutral ground. Your neutral ground is the only place in 100 miles where the kill order doesn't apply. Ronan met the older man's eyes. And I need what's in her pack to reach the right hands. I need your communication network. Another long moment. The amber lights of Mirath burned steadily behind Kale Morrow's shoulder, and the wolves moving between the structures had stopped moving, had oriented, were watching with the silent attention of a community that had learned to read situations from the posture of its leaders. Come inside, Kale Morrow said. Treat. What happened in the next 6 hours was of a different order than anything that had happened in the mountains. The mountains had been about survival. The immediate, physical, terrain and weather, and hunter's reality of staying alive and moving. Mirath was about something that required different skills. The precise, deliberate process of taking an argument apart and reassembling it in a form that other people could receive. Kale Morrow had, it turned out, been quietly building exactly the kind of network that Leora had needed for years and hadn't known existed. A communication web across the independent packs, the Greywood Federation, the Halvern Coalition, the Northern Free Territories, that operated below the Council's visibility specifically because the Council had never taken the independent packs seriously enough to surveil them carefully. They were, in the Council's architecture, peripheral, minor. The kind of wolves who could be managed by exclusion rather than oversight. That assessment, KL told them with a dry satisfaction that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment, was going to turn out to be the council's most consequential error. Leora laid the records out on the broad table in Mirath's communication room, and 3 of Kael's senior representatives went through them with the focused, systematic attention of people who had heard rumors for years and were now looking at the substance beneath the rumors. The room was quiet for a long time, the only sounds, the turning of pages, and the occasional low exchange between the readers. Then one of the representatives, a woman, compact and sharp-eyed, whose name was Dara, and who had the specific manner of someone who had been building a legal case in her head for years and was now watching the evidence arrive, looked up from the intake logs. "This is Mira Voss," she said. She was looking at Leora. "Age 9 at intake." "Yes," Leora said. "I know this name." Dara's voice was very carefully controlled. Her family reported her missing 4 years ago to every pack authority that would listen. The council told them she had been voluntarily relocated to a healing program. She set the page down with absolute deliberateness. She was 9 years old. The room was completely silent. "How many more like her?" Kael asked. "In this file alone." Leora had gone through the numbers during the travel. 14 under age 12 at time of intake. 41 total minor age intakes across the complete catalog. She paused. Ashvale alone had 6 minors in the ward during my time there. That's 6 I can personally verify. Dara looked at the pile of files. "And the council has been sitting on these records." "The council created these records," Ronan said from across the table. His voice was quiet. "SOAR built the program with full Iron Council authorization. Every intake was documented and approved at the senior council level, which means the program is not SOAR's rogue operation," Ronan said. "It's council policy, documented and deliberate for 15 years. The implication settled over the room with the weight of a thing that changed the shape of everything around it. Leora watched it land on each of the representatives, watched them each do the calculation of what it meant that the governing body of their realm had been operating a systematic capture and detention program against their own population, documented and deliberate, for 15 years. Kael Morrow leaned back in his chair and looked at Ronan Vale across the table with an expression that was complex and old, and had things moving in it that she didn't have full context for. 7 years ago, Kael said slowly, when you introduced the charter. They exiled me before it could go to formal vote, Ronan said, because if it went to formal vote, the independent packs had standing to weigh in. And if the independent packs weighed in, it would have passed, Kael said. The votes were there from our end. We were waiting for the formal process. He was quiet for a moment. They knew that. They knew. Another silence. This one with the specific quality of something being finally understood that should have been understood years ago. The clarity that came too late, that arrived carrying its own specific grief. "What do you need from us?" Kael asked. He was looking at Ronan, but then his eyes moved to Leora, and the shift was deliberate. The kind of correction that happened when someone realized they'd directed a question to the wrong person. She held his gaze. "We need the records distributed to every independent pack with standing to bring formal charges under the Interpack Treaty Articles," she said. "We need communication sent to the Free Territories requesting an emergency session of the Interpack Tribunal. That body exists outside Council authority and has jurisdiction over charter violations." She paused. "And we need someone to go to Asheville." To Asheville. The Omega healers there need to know what's coming. They need to know that when the tribunal session is called, their situation is included, that they're not going to be left inside while the legal process runs on the outside. She looked at Kael steadily. "I made a promise. I intend to keep it." Kael Morrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ronan, and the look that passed between the two men had history in it. 7 years of history at minimum. The weight of a decision deferred and a support withheld, and the cost of both. "I should have backed the charter when you introduced it," Kael said. Ronan said nothing. "I was managing my own political position with the council. I told myself the time wasn't right." The older man's voice was flat with self-assessment. "The time was exactly right, and I stepped back." "Yes, Ronan said. Not accusatory, just accurate. I won't step back now. No, Ronan said. You won't. Kyle nodded once, slowly, and turned to his representatives. Send the copies tonight. Every pack with tribunal standing, priority communication. Get runners to the Halvern Coalition and the Northern Territories. He looked at Dara. Can you draft the formal tribunal request? I've had the draft in my head for 3 years, Dara said. I can have it written in an hour. Then write it. He turned back to Leora. Ashvale. I'll go myself, she said. No. Ronan's voice from across the table. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes directly, and there was no dominance in it, no alpha imperative, just a specific, solid concern that she recognized as the kind that came from knowing a person rather than from category. Ashvale is the most dangerous place you can be right now, he said. Warden Drace knows your scent, knows your capabilities, knows you escaped. The moment you approach that compound, I know the compound, she said. I know every exit, every rotation schedule, every structural weakness in the compound wall. She paused. And I have a capability that changes the field conditions of any conflict it enters. You said so yourself. I said the capability exists. I didn't say using it a second time at that magnitude. I know the cost. Leora. She looked at him across the table in the amber light of Mirath's communication room, with the records spread between them and 3 representatives watching and Kale Morrow watching, and the weight of everything they'd survived in the last 5 days in the air between them. I made a promise to a 13-year-old girl in a healer's ward, she said quietly. I'm going to keep it. The silence stretched. She watched him go through the same process she'd watched him go through at the cabin, and on the slope, and in the corridor of Valdriet. The calculation, the arrival at the conclusion, the settling of the decision. Then I go with you, he said. That's not a request for permission, she said. I know, neither is that. Something in the room shifted. Kale Morrow making a small, barely audible sound that might have been the repressed relative of approval. Dara was looking at her papers with the studied attention of someone giving 2 people a private moment in a public space. Leora looked at Ronan for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. Outside Mirath's walls, the runners were already being dispatched, moving into the dark on fast feet with copied records and sealed packets, spreading out across the independent territories like water finding its level, carrying in their hands the documentary evidence of 15 years of systematic harm that was about to arrive all at once in the hands of every wolf with the standing and the will to do something about it. The Iron Council didn't know yet. Davin Soar, recovering in the Valdris fortress with a very significant headache, didn't know yet. Warden Drace, running a compound that would shortly receive its own copy of its own intake records, didn't know yet. But Kale Morrow's network was moving, and the Interpack Tribunal request was being drafted, and in the communication room of a small way station at the intersection of 3 valleys, the shape of things had already irrevocably changed. Leora sat with her hands on the table and looked at the closed file that held Mira's name, and she was tired in every way a person could be tired, and she was not done yet, and she was going anyway. Ronan's hand came to rest on the table beside hers, not touching, not claiming, just present, a fixed point, offered freely. She turned her hand over and set it against his, and he closed his fingers around it with the care of someone who understood that the thing they were holding was not fragile but was precious, and that the distinction mattered. Outside, the runners ran. The mountain held its cold, and the stars were out for the first time in days. And somewhere north of them, the council's machinery was grinding toward a response it had not yet understood. It was already too late to make. Outside, the runners ran. They moved through the night in every direction from Mirath like spokes from a wheel's center, each carrying sealed packets of copied records that Kale Morrow's people had produced with the efficient, practiced speed of an organization that had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of moment for longer than anyone had officially acknowledged. By the time Leora and Ronan left the communication room to sleep, 4 hours, no more, both of them passed the threshold where functioning without rest was responsible. The first runners had already crossed into Halvern Coalition territory, and the draft tribunal request was finished and being copied for distribution. She slept without dreaming, which was new. In Asheville, she had always dreamed. Vivid, detailed, architectural dreams of the compound's layout, the walls, the locked doors. The dreams of someone whose body kept rehearsing escape, even when the mind was unconscious. In the mountains, she had slept too hard and too briefly for dreams to form. Here, in a narrow bunk in Mirath's way station, with a blanket that smelled of pine resin and the low amber light bleeding under the door, she simply went dark and came back 4 hours later clean. Ronan was already awake. He was sitting at the small table in the corridor outside the sleeping room with a cup of something hot, and Kael Moro's map spread before him, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway with the immediate, complete attention that she had come to understand was simply how he was. Not hypervigilance, not the anxious monitoring of someone who needed to control the room, just the natural quality of someone who was genuinely present. "Dara has news," he said. "Good news or the other kind?" "Both." He moved the maps to give her space to sit. The Halvern runner arrived back an hour ago. The Coalition's senior representative has confirmed they'll convene for the tribunal session. They'd been waiting for standing cause, and the records provide it. A pause. "The other news is that Valdris sent a communication overnight to Mirath's outer stations. They know we're here." Leora poured herself tea from the pot on the table and sat down. "How long before they act on that knowledge?" "The Council's authority doesn't extend to Mirath. They can't send hunters here without violating the Neutral Ground Treaty, which, given that the tribunal request is already in process, would be an exceptionally stupid political move." His voice was even. "They know that. So they'll wait us out, or they'll try to move on Asheville before we do." She had been thinking about that all night, or the part of her that kept working even while the rest of her was dark had been thinking about it. "Drace will get the news through council channels before we arrive if we delay." "Yes." "Then we don't delay." "I know." He looked at the map. "There's a route south that avoids the Valdris Valley entirely. It adds half a day." "Take it." She looked at the map over his shoulder. The route was clear, longer, more demanding in the middle section where the terrain bunched up into a series of steep-sided ravines, but clean of council presence. "How far is Asheville from the southern approach?" 6 hours from the point where we leave the ravine system." He traced the line with one finger. "We arrive at dusk." "Dusk is good." She drank her tea. "Drace runs his primary guard rotation change at dusk. There's a 12-minute window when both the outgoing and incoming guard teams are in transition, and the compound's east wall has reduced coverage." Ronan looked at her. "I told you," she said. "I spent 9 years memorizing that place." "You did tell me." They left Mirath 2 hours after dawn, provisioned and rested and moving with the specific, settled quality of people who had made their decision and were now simply executing it. Kael Moro stood at the way station's outer marker to see them go, and when Leora passed him, he held out a sealed packet. "Copies of the tribunal filing and a letter of safe conduct from the Greywood Federation," he said. "If you encounter any independent pack authority between here and Asheville, those documents establish your standing." He paused. "And there's a message inside for the Omegas at Asheville, from the 2 who came through here before you, in case—" He stopped. "In case they need to know they're not alone," Leora said. "Yes." She took the packet and put it inside her coat. Then she looked at Kael Moro, who had the expression of a man carrying a 7-year-old debt he was only now beginning to repay. "When this is over," she said, "I'm going to hold you to every word you said last night." "I expect you to," Kael said. She turned south. The ravine system was everything the map had suggested. Steep-walled, cold, the kind of terrain that demanded constant attention and gave nothing back except difficulty. They moved through it in the rhythm they had developed over 5 days, the rhythm that had its own efficiency now, each of them knowing how the other moved without having to watch every step. The half-day addition felt longer than that in the ravines, the limited sky overhead giving the light a compressed quality, the cold channeled and intensified by the walls. But they came out the south end in the mid-afternoon with the route to Asheville open before them and the timeline holding, and Leora felt something shift in her chest that she recognized as the particular feeling of a thing you have been building toward for a very long time coming finally into view. They didn't speak much in the last 6 hours. There wasn't much that needed to be said. The plan was clear, and the terrain required attention, and they were both carrying their own version of what was coming. But at one point, descending a long slope through old-growth pine, Ronan spoke. "After this," he said. She looked at him sideways. "After this what?" "After Asheville. After the tribunal." He was quiet for a moment, looking ahead. "I've been exiled for 7 years. The exile was the council's act, and the council's authority is about to be significantly diminished." He paused. "There are pacts that will want the throne re-legitimized. There are governance structures that need rebuilding from the foundation." Another pause. "I'm telling you that I know what's coming, that it's going to be complex and political and the opposite of this mountain." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that whatever is coming, the throne, the council restructuring, all of it, none of it changes anything I've said to you, or not said." He glanced at her briefly. "You're not a circumstance of my exile. You're not a complication of my return. You are—" He stopped, and she watched him search for the word with the same precision she'd seen before. The man who used language carefully and wouldn't deploy it carelessly even now. "You're the reason the return is worth making." Leora walked for several paces, holding that. Then, "That's a very large thing to say on a mountainside." "I'm aware." "You're going to have to say it again somewhere warmer." Something moved in his face that was not the ghost of a smile, and was not the 3-second genuine smile, but something else, quieter and deeper, and more durable than both. "I'll say it as many times as it needs saying." She looked ahead at the slope and the trees and the darkening sky, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 9 years, or possibly in longer, possibly since she was 12, and the world still had the dimensions of possibility rather than the dimensions of a compound wall. She felt the specific, terrifying, irreversible feeling of having something to protect that wasn't a survival resource, something that was simply, entirely hers. She walked closer to his shoulder. He didn't comment on it. He adjusted his stride. "What?" Asheville appeared at dusk exactly as she'd calculated. A compound of dark buildings behind a stone perimeter wall, amber light at the guard positions, the specific institutional smell of enclosed wolf community and medicinal herbs, and the particular staleness of recycled air that she had breathed for 9 years and would know at any distance. She stopped at the tree line and looked at it. Ronan stood beside her, reading the layout from the ground the same way she was, with the quiet, methodical assessment of someone who was building an operational picture in real time. "East wall?" she said. "There. The section between the 2 guard posts. The guard rotation happens in the next—" She looked at the angle of the light. 8 minutes. "I see it." He scanned the perimeter. The main gate is west-facing. Drace's quarters are in the north building, the one with the larger windows. Yes. She had looked at those windows for 9 years. "He'll know we're coming. He'll have had council communication. He'll have had council communication telling him we escaped Valdris," Ronan said. "He won't know we came here. We moved faster than his information." She assessed that. It was probably accurate. Probably. The probably was the part she would have to manage. "Mira's in the south building," she said. "Third room from the east end, ground level. I know because I requested it for her when she arrived. The ground level south rooms get the most afternoon light, and the worst of the healing work is done by light." She paused. "If I can reach the south building before Drace is alerted, I can bring her out. And the others, there are 5 Omegas in that building currently, if nothing's changed in 11 days. A lot can change in 11 days. Yes, but Drace doesn't move the healers unless he has a specific reason. They're too useful in place, and he doesn't like operational disruption." She looked at the wall. "He'll have a reason now. If he knows I escaped with records, he'll understand the exposure. He might have already—" She stopped the thought. "We move now." The rotation window opened in the guard posts, and they moved. She went over the east wall with Ronan's lift and the 4 years of muscle memory of having mapped every handhold in that wall during her twice-daily herb garden rotations, and she was over and down in the interior shadow in under 15 seconds. Ronan came over behind her, silent and enormous, and somehow managing the wall's dimensions without making it look effortful, and they pressed against the inner face and listened. The transition was still in progress. She could hear the outgoing guards moving away and the incoming guards not yet settled into their posts. The 12-minute window was real. It had always been real. She had counted it 100 times from the wrong side of the wall. She led. That was instinctive and not symbolic. She knew this ground and he didn't, and the knowledge was the decisive variable. She moved through the interior paths with the specific sureness of someone who had walked them in darkness, in distress, in all conditions, and knew every irregularity in the stone underfoot and every shadow deep enough to stand in. The south building door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. The Omega healers were not considered flight risks in the way that the higher security detainees were, because the suppression protocols in the compound psychology had been designed to make the idea of flight feel impossible. She had escaped by convincing herself that impossible was a story told by the people who benefited from it. She pushed the door open. The south building corridor was lit by low wall-mounted lamps, amber and quiet. She knew which rooms were occupied and in what order. She went to the third door from the east end and opened it without knocking, because knocking would have made sound. Mira was sitting on the edge of her bunk with a book in her lap, and she looked up at the sound of the door, and for one frozen moment Leora saw what the 4 years had done to the child she'd known. Still small, still dark-eyed, but the eyes now held something that had been added by time and circumstance, a weight that shouldn't have been there in a 13-year-old face. Then Mira recognized her. The book hit the floor. "You came back," Mira said. She was using her hands the way they communicated, the way Leora had taught her. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I told you I would." Leora crossed the room and crouched in front of her. "Can you move? Right now, can you move?" Mira looked at her face, reading it the way she had learned to read faces, the way all of them had learned, because faces were the only information that was always available. Then she nodded. "Get your coat," Leora said. "Get anything you can't leave. You have 2 minutes." Mira moved. Leora went to the next room, and the next, and Ronan was at the corridor entrance maintaining the watch. And 4 minutes after she had come through the south building door, she had 5 Omegas. Mira and 4 others, ranging from 16 to 32, all of them with the specific quality of people who had been suppressed and contained for so long that the concept of moving freely had to be relearned in real time, assembled in the corridor. One of them, a woman named Sable, whose healing gift ran to bone knitting and who had been in Ashvale for 6 years, looked at Ronan in the doorway with the automatic alarm of a trained suppressed Omega encountering an unknown Alpha in a confined space. Leora put her hand on Sable's arm. "He's with me. He's safe. I promise you." Sable looked at her. 9 years of Leora's word being the most reliable thing in the compound. "All right," she said. "All right," Leora said. "We go." They were 3 minutes from the east wall when the alarm sounded. It was not the signal horn she had heard from Valdris. This was Ashvale's internal alarm, a series of struck iron bars that sent a tone through the compound with the quality of something that had been built to be heard in the healer's ward in the dead of night and get everyone out of bed. She had heard it twice in 9 years, both times for compound security drills, and the sound of it now was both entirely familiar and entirely different. "Run," Ronan said, and it was the only instruction needed. They ran, Leora leading, the 5 Omegas behind her, Ronan at the rear in the position that covered the group from behind, and the compound erupted around them. Lights, voices, the sound of boots on stone from the direction of the main building. She ran the path she knew and didn't look back and counted her steps to the east wall because the east wall was the only door. Warden Drace came around the corner of the herb storage shed with 3 guards, and he stopped dead when he saw them. She had thought about this moment. In the hours of running and the hours of planning and the 9 years before that, she had thought about this moment and what it would look like and what she would do. She had imagined it as something that required action or words or a confrontation with a specific shape. What she had not imagined was that it would feel like nothing. Drace was a large man, large in the way that men were large when the systems around them had decided that their largeness was power and had spent years confirming that belief. He had a pale face and small eyes, and he was looking at her now with an expression that cycled rapidly through several things: recognition, calculation, fury, and underneath all of it, The part she had not anticipated, the part that was new, something that looked unmistakably like fear. Leora. His voice had the authority of a man who had always been obeyed in this space. Warden Drace. She had stopped moving. The 5 Omegas were behind her, and Ronan was behind them, and the east wall was 40 feet to her right. "You have no standing here," Drace said. "You escaped custody. I have a letter of safe conduct from the Greywood Federation," she said. "I have a copy of the Interpact Tribunal filing, and I have the complete intake records of this compound documenting 15 years of illegal detentions, including 14 intakes of children under age 10. She met his eyes, including Mira Voss, whom you brought in at age 9. The 3 guards behind Drace were looking at each other. She noted this, the specific quality of men who had been receiving information through channels and were now doing a rapid recalculation of what they were standing inside. "Those records were obtained illegally," Drace said. His voice had changed very slightly, not enough for a stranger to detect. She was not a stranger. "They were obtained from a facility that doesn't officially exist, operated under protocols that violate the Interpact Treaty articles that govern the Council's authority," she said. "The tribunal has standing to determine legality, not you. The tribunal has already received the filing." She held his gaze. "The Halvern Coalition confirmed last night. The Greywood Federation confirmed this morning. The Northern Territories are in process." She paused. "It's done, Warden. The only question now is what you choose to do in the next 10 seconds. Drace looked at her. He looked at Ronan behind the group. And she saw the moment he recognized Ronan, the specific shift of a man recognizing the exact scope of what he was facing. Then he looked at his 3 guards. The guards were not moving to advance. One of them, the youngest, a wolf she recognized from compound rotations, a boy who had always been careful about which warden he was within earshot of, took a step back. "Stand down," the boy said to the other 2. His voice was quiet and entirely resolved. "This is over." Drace turned on him. "You are—" "I've been in this compound for 3 years," the young guard said. "I've known what happens in the healer's ward. I've known about the intake protocols." His voice didn't waver. "I never said anything because I didn't think there was anything to say it to." He looked at Leora. "There is now." The other 2 guards stepped back. Drace stood alone in the compound path with the lights burning around him and the night air sharp with cold, and he looked at Leora across 10 feet of ground that had been his authority for so long that the loss of it was not yet fully real to him. She could see that, the gap between the reality and his processing of it. "You can walk out of this compound, or you can be walked out of it," Ronan said from behind the group. His voice was the quiet, absolute voice. "That choice is still yours." Drace made no move. Leora turned to Mira, who was standing at her left shoulder with those dark, old-in-a-young-face eyes watching everything. "East Wall," she said quietly. "The same place I showed you. Do you remember?" Mira looked at her and smiled. Small, careful, the smile of a child who had been keeping something protected for a long time. "I found it 2 years ago," she said. "I used to stand next to it sometimes." "Then show the others." Mira turned and led, and the 4 other Omegas followed her, and Leora stood for one more moment facing the compound she had spent 9 years inside while Ronan moved up beside her. She looked at the walls and the buildings and the amber lights that she had never once, in 9 years, been allowed to control. The lights that were turned on and off by the wardens on their schedule, that defined when you woke and when you slept, and when the day was permitted to begin and end. She didn't say anything to Drace. There was nothing to say that wasn't already said. She turned and walked to the east wall, and she went over it for the last time. The Interpact Tribunal convened 19 days later. It met at Mirath, which was the only location with the standing and the neutrality to host it. Kael Moro's network had spent those 19 days with the organized, methodical energy of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment and were not going to waste it now that it was here. Representatives came from 11 independent packs, the Halvern Coalition, the Greywood Federation, and 3 Northern Territories. They came with the records, copies of copies, distributed so widely that any attempt by the Council to suppress the original would be an act of spectacular futility, and they came with witnesses. The witnesses were the thing that changed the shape of the proceedings from what the council had expected. The council sent 3 senior members to the tribunal with the intention of reframing the records as evidence of a medical program operating within charter provisions. They had prepared arguments. They had legal representatives. They came with the confidence of a body that had controlled the discourse for 15 years and expected to continue controlling it now. They had not prepared for Sable. Sable stood before the tribunal in the clean, certain voice of a woman who had been bone-knitting wolves in the healer's ward of Ashvale for 6 years and had a very detailed account of exactly what that had entailed, and she spoke for 40 minutes without notes, and the council's legal representatives made several attempts to interrupt and were ruled out of order each time. When Sable sat down, a woman named Ari, who had been in the compound for 4 years, stood up. And after Ari, there were 2 others who had come through Mirath in the months before Leora. And by the time the 4th witness sat down, the council members' legal preparation had the quality of a structure that had been built for a different weather. Leora testified last. She had never spoken before a body like this. 11 representatives, the tribunal chair, the observers from 24 packs filling the large room to its edges, every eye in the space directed at her. She had spent 9 years cultivating invisibility, and the opposite of invisibility was this: a room full of people looking directly at her, waiting. She stood at the tribunal table and she spoke for an hour and 20 minutes, and she did not perform for them. She did not modulate her voice for effect or shape the narrative for impact. She simply told them what had happened, in the order it had happened, with the precision and clarity of a healer presenting a case, because that was what it was. A case. The case of a population that had been told systematically and deliberately that their gifts and their designations and their choices belonged to anyone but themselves, and what that had cost, and what it needed to cost the people who had built the system. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then the tribunal chair, an old she-wolf from the Northern Territories named Ash, who had the quality of someone who had lived long enough to be entirely done with dishonesty, looked at the council representatives and said, "Do you wish to respond?" The senior council representative, a man named Vorel, who had been part of the Iron Council for 12 years, and had the careful, composed face of someone who had spent 12 years managing difficult situations, looked at Leora across the tribunal table. Something in his face, over the course of her testimony, had changed. Not remorse. She was not going to grant him remorse, not yet, not after 19 days, but something that was at least the precursor to it. The expression of someone who had been presented with the full accounting of their choices and had been forced to remain in the room while all of it was read aloud. "No," Vorel said. His voice was very quiet. "We do not." The tribunal chair nodded. "Then we'll proceed to deliberation." The deliberation took 3 days. Leora spent those 3 days at Mirath in a state she didn't immediately have a name for, not rest, because she was doing things, attending to the people who had come out of Ashvale and the people who had arrived from other compounds, whose existence she hadn't known about until the tribunal process had begun shaking things loose. She was doing what she was trained to do, assessing, treating, using the gift in its careful, targeted form, keeping the people around her in functioning order. On the second day, Mira sat beside her while she was preparing a standard wound treatment for one of the Northern Territory observers who had traveled through difficult conditions to get there, and watched her hands with the specific attention of someone who was learning rather than simply watching. "Can you show me that?" Mira said. She was using her hands still, the habit of the compound deep in her muscle memory. "The mixing." Leora looked at her. Leora looked at the wound preparation. The whole thing, the assessment, the preparation, the application. Mira paused. "I've been watching healers for 4 years. I want to know how to do it properly." "Your gift isn't restoration," Leora said. "The file says emergent unclassified." "I know, but healing is more than gifts." Mira met her eyes, those old eyes, level and direct. "You taught me that when I was small." Leora set down the preparation and turned to face her fully. "Tell me what you've observed so far," she said. And Mira began to explain in careful detail everything she had noticed, the technique, the reasoning, the judgment calls, with the articulation of someone who had been paying very close attention for a very long time and needed only the permission to speak it out loud. Leora taught her for 2 hours. It was the best 2 hours of the 19 days. On the third morning, Ronan found her before the tribunal session reconvened, in the narrow corridor outside the deliberation room where she had been standing because standing was the only option. The waiting was not the kind that could be sat through. It required the kinetic option of being on her feet. He came and stood beside her, and for a while they didn't speak, and that was fine. Then, "Whatever they decide," he said, "the records exist. The witnesses testified. That doesn't go back." "I know. I mean," he paused, searching again for precision. "Whatever the tribunal's formal ruling, the compound has been exposed. The program has been named. The people who built it are facing a proceeding that has been attended by representatives from 23 packs. He looked at her. SOAR will never operate that program again. Ashvale's current detainees are in Mirath's temporary facilities and are not going back to a compound. Drace is under tribunal review." He paused. "The thing you went to do is done." She looked at him. "You sound like you're preparing me for a bad verdict." "I'm preparing for all verdicts." He met her eyes. "Because you worked for 11 days across the worst terrain in the northern ranges and walked back into the place you escaped from and testified for an hour and 20 minutes in front of 23 packs. I want you to know that none of that is conditional on what 3 tribunal judges decide this morning." She looked at him for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what he'd said and what he hadn't, and what he'd given back to her over the course of the last 19 days. Not safety, not comfort, not the kind of protection that required her to be less than she was. Just this: the absolute unqualified recognition of what she had done and who she was doing it as. She kissed him. In the narrow corridor outside the deliberation room, with the sounds of the tribunal's reconvening coming through the door, she stepped forward and kissed him with the specific intention of someone who had spent 9 years keeping all their choices very small and had decided completely and irrevocably that they were done with small. He kissed her back with the careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything, and she thought distantly that this was exactly what she should have expected from him. When she pulled back, his eyes were very dark and very present, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the corridor of the fortress, in the rockfall, on the mountainside, like something that had changed the dimensions of what he understood to be possible. "The verdict," she said, because the sounds from inside had changed. "Yes," he said. His voice was different, the good kind of different. They went in. The tribunal's verdict was complete. The Iron Council's collection protocols were ruled a systematic violation of the Interpact Treaty Articles, governing personal autonomy and the designation of forced labor. The Valdris facility was ordered sealed pending a full accounting of its detainee records. Davin Soar and Warden Drace were suspended from all authority positions pending individual tribunal proceedings. The Omega Catalog program was dissolved in its entirety, and in a provision that the tribunal chair read with the particular slowness of someone who understood its weight, the exiled status of Ronan Vale, former Alpha King, was formally declared void. The exile had been imposed by council action, and the council's authority to impose it was found to have been itself in violation of the Interpact Governance Charter at the time of the action. 7 years of exile, retroactively null. The room received this in silence for approximately 3 seconds. Then it did not receive it in silence. Leora sat at the witness table and listened to the room come apart around her with the noise of 23 packs simultaneously processing a verdict that had just reshaped their political reality, and she felt, underneath the noise and the magnitude of it, a very specific, very quiet thing. Not triumph. Not the dramatic sense of vindication she'd imagined on the worst nights in Asheville when she'd let herself imagine winning. Just the clean, structural feeling of a thing falling into its right place. The feeling of a wall coming down that had been in the wrong position for a very long time. She looked at Ronan. He was sitting at the table beside her, and his face was doing nothing it could be accused of, which was the face he wore when the thing he was feeling was too large for the expression that was publicly appropriate. She knew this about him now. She had 9 years of reading faces in difficult circumstances, and she knew exactly what that particular stillness meant. She put her hand over his on the table, the way he had done for her at Mirath's communication table the night this had begun to turn. He turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers, and neither of them looked away from the front of the room, and neither of them needed to. In the weeks that followed, the mountain range above Mirath acquired the quality of a place where something had happened that was still being felt. The independent packs moved fast, faster than anyone who had underestimated them for 15 years had been prepared for. The tribunal's verdict gave them standing, and the standing gave them authority, and the authority gave them the ability to do the things they had been preparing to do for a long time, waiting for exactly this kind of cause. Governance structures were reviewed. Charter provisions were reopened. The detained Omegas at Mirath's temporary facilities were offered choices, genuine choices, with genuine support for whatever they chose. For the first time in the time they'd been held, Mira chose to stay at Mirath and continue her healer training. She informed Leora of this decision with the composure of a 13-year-old who had decided on a course of action and was not consulting for approval, but for acknowledgement. Leora acknowledged it without revision. "You'll need formal instruction," Leora said, "not just watching." "I know. Dara found someone, a healer from the Greywood territory who teaches." Mira paused. She also said that when the council restructuring is complete, you're going to need healers trained outside the old protocols. That's true. So I'm going to be trained outside the old protocols. Mira looked at her with those old, level eyes. And then I'm going to work with you. Leora looked at her for a long moment. The girl who had watched her leave with silent eyes in a dark hallway and had kept herself intact for the 4 years between, and had led 4 strangers to the east wall of their compound in the dark. "All right," Leora said. Mira nodded, once, with the decisiveness of someone who had grown up in circumstances that didn't permit uncertainty and had made it a strength rather than a loss. The rebuilding of this governance structure took longer than the verdict itself. That was the nature of it. The verdict was a moment, a line, a door. The rebuilding was the work that happened on the other side of the door, and it was the harder work, the work without dramatic resolution, the work that required the sustained application of intelligence and patience and the willingness to sit in rooms for very long hours, making decisions that were mostly not about principles, but about specifics. The specific mundane details of how principles became practices, became reality. Ronan did that work. She watched him do it. In the meetings at Mirath, in the communications with PAC representatives, in the long evenings reviewing the governance documents that K.L. Morrow's network had been compiling for years. He brought to it the same quality he brought to everything, unhurried, precise, the kind of leadership that didn't perform but simply functioned, that created clarity around itself the way a good fire created warmth, not because it was trying to, but because that was its nature. She watched him do it, and she did her own work beside it, which was different in shape but equal in substance. The Omega healers who had come out of Ashvale and the other compounds needed more than legal freedom. They needed the slower, more complicated work of rebuilding the internal architecture that years of captivity had altered. She did that work with the same focused competence she'd always had, but differently now, without the need to be invisible, without the suppression, without keeping the gift controlled below the threshold of detection. She used the gift openly for the first time in her adult life, and the difference was not just in the work, it was in the feeling of the work. The gift running at its natural level, uncontained, directed by her own assessment and her own judgment. Expensive, still. The cost was always real, but clean, in the way that things were clean when they were doing what they were built to do. One evening, 3 weeks into the rebuilding work, she was sitting on the rock shelf outside Mirath's east wall at the end of a long day, watching the last light leave the frozen peaks to the north, when Ronan came and sat beside her. They sat in the specific comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to use silence to survive, but had retained its quality because some things were simply better held quietly. "The council representatives requested a formal meeting tomorrow," he said. "Vorel wants to discuss the transition framework." "I know, Dara told me." "I want you in the meeting." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the new framework needs to address the healer designation specifically, and you're the person with both the authority and the knowledge to drive that section." He met her eyes. "And because I won't be making decisions about a population you know better than I do without you in the room." "That's not how it worked before." With the old council. I'm aware. His voice was quiet. That's why I said it. She held his gaze, then she turned back to the peaks, which were going from gold to the deep blue-white of high altitude in winter, the colors of ice given back by a sky that had decided to be extraordinary for exactly this moment. There's a provision in the old charter, she said. Article 23. It was never activated because the conditions for it were never met. It allows for the designation of a co-authority in the governance structure, not a secondary position, not a subordinate designation, but a true co-authority. Equal standing, equal governance weight. She felt him go still beside her. It was written into the original charter by the founders, she continued, before the council stripped the framework down to its current form. It requires both parties to be present before the full assembly of independent pacts and to declare the co-authority bond. She paused. Dara found it 3 days ago. She told me this morning. A long silence. The peaks were deepening to indigo. A co-authority bond, Ronan said very carefully. Not a mating declaration before a tribunal, she said. Not a political mating arranged by a council. A declaration made by choice before an assembly because both parties choose it. She looked at him. The distinction matters. His eyes were doing the thing she had no category for. Still, even now, the thing that was too large and too specific for a single word. Yes, he said. That distinction matters more than anything. I know. She held his gaze. So, do you want to tell me what you told me on the mountainside again? Somewhere warmer. Ronan Vale, former exiled king, current pain in the council's archive, man who smiled only when it was real. Smiled. Not the 3-second smile, not the ghost of one. The full, unhurried, entirely genuine smile that changed his whole face and made him look like what he actually was underneath the 7 years of exile and the hard terrain and all the rest of it. Someone who had wanted very badly, for a very long time, for things to be different, and who was, improbably and completely, here. You're the reason the return is worth making, he said, and that's not contingent on a title or a charter provision or a governance structure. He looked at her steadily. It's contingent on you. She breathed in the cold air of the mountain evening and the frozen peaks and the clean smell of pine and snow, and she felt the 9 years of compound walls and the 11 days of mountains and the 19 days of testimony and waiting and work. And she felt Mira's old eyes in a young face and Sable's voice in the tribunal room, and Cale Morrow's careful acknowledgement of a debt paid and a debt still being paid, and the runners going out into the dark from Mirath with records in their hands, and all of it, arrived at this. A rock shelf at the edge of a way station in the mountain ranges, in the last light of an extraordinary day, with a man who had sat in a chair for 3 hours while she slept in his furs because she needed the rest, and he understood that. All right, she said. All right, he said. Below them, Mirath was warm and lit and full of the sound of 23 packs rebuilding something from the foundations up. The slow, specific, unromantic work of making a different world out of the materials of the existing one. It was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time. The wrong things that had been built over 15 years would take at least that long to properly unmake, and the building of new things in their place was not guaranteed and was not simple, and would require the sustained, unglamorous attention of people who were willing to stay in the room. Leora was willing to stay in the room. She looked at the peaks one more time, indigo deepening to the absolute dark blue of high-altitude night, the first stars appearing at the very top of the sky, the frozen summits catching the last of the light and holding it like they intended to keep it. And she felt, in the space below her ribs where 9 years of captivity had kept everything very small and very still, the specific and extraordinary sensation of everything beginning, finally, to move. She stood. She held out her hand to Ronan, and he took it, and they turned away from the peaks and walked back toward the lights.